just unshare, stop the share. Exactly.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started. I'm going to do a more full set of introductory and framing remarks in a moment. I'm Sari Altschuler. I'm an associate professor here in the English department, and I run Health Humanities and Society here at Northeastern. But before I get started, our wonderful dean, Uta Poiger, is joining us, which is delightful. She's dean of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities and professor of history at Northeastern University. With the college's faculty, staff, and students, she works to enhance the college's and the university's leadership in experiential liberal arts. This summer, she will take up her new role as special advisor for humanics initiatives to the provost, where she will collaborate with colleagues across Northeastern's campus network to build curricular innovations that integrate human, data, and technological literacies with community engagement. As a historian, Poiger's work is also close to the spirit of this gathering. In her scholarship, she examines 20th century German culture and society from a transnational perspective and places that research in terms of race and gender. And we're just delighted to have her at the symposium. So welcome, Dean Poiger.
Thank you very much, Sari, for this kind introduction. Could I just get a hand from those of you who are on Zoom just to make sure that you can actually hear us? Could we just have you raise your hands? Very good. I think we are seeing lots of evidence that the audio is working.
Proof, not evidence.
Okay, all right. You will debate that with me in just a second. We have proof. Very good. So it's just a pleasure to welcome all of you on Zoom and all of you in the room here in 909 in Renaissance Park in Boston on the Northeastern campus to this symposium, which is called the Comparative Health Humanities Symposium. And it is, of course, the result of an important cross-river as well as transatlantic collaboration. So bodies of water, no barriers here. And it's really lovely that this is such a triangulation, that two Boston institutions are collaborating together, Northeastern and Harvard, and that this collaboration really is one with several institutions in Paris as well. I just apologize right away. My French has gotten so bad that I won't make any attempts in my introduction today. And at the same time, just want to take a moment to reflect on how exciting it is. First of all, that in this phase of the pandemic, we're actually able to fly across the Atlantic again and are able to gather in person as well as also to gather in these hybrid formats. And then on the other end, I'm also really excited to hear about comparative and health and humanities, all portions of this title really. And I will just say that from my own work, you may, for example, find something that I was involved in that's called the Modern Girl Around the World project, which edited a volume now many, many years ago. From my own work that has always had comparisons between different parts of the globe, in my case, especially between East Asia, the United States, and Europe as an important facet of thinking, I learned that really, especially as humanists, it's particularly useful to think about comparison and also connection together. And certainly you are making scholarly connections, but the big themes that are outlined on the program, from questions of race to questions on the environment, of course, questions of health, ability, illness, so much centered. I do think, again, it's useful to think about both comparison, but also think about connection. And in that context, I also do think that humanists are particularly well positioned to help broader communities think about the politics of scale. I think if the pandemic taught us anything, we learned once again how much trust in science is actually lacking. We also learned at the same time that local and international and national governments are of great significance in these kinds of contexts. So again, as we are thinking about connection, the connection between the broad global forces and what is going on locally, I think we again learned really affect the health of individuals to this day. And of course, we have more and more understanding, thanks to the work of many of you, that this was historically, in fact, the case as well. So these are just a few thoughts. Overall, the health humanities at Northeastern are really playing an important role in this terminology that Sari kindly alluded to, this thinking about humanics, which is really designed to tackle big challenges of our day, bring perspectives of past and present to those challenges, but also to foster interdisciplinary collaborations and conversations that take society, culture, take also the vast amounts of data that are now available to us and that yet at the same time are so insufficient because they too reflect the insufficiencies of human societies, and also to take into consideration how technology needs to be looked at both in critical terms, but can also support us in our path forward. Again, a very warm welcome on behalf of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities and on behalf of Northeastern to this intense gathering of 2 days, and I wish you great success in your deliberations and look forward to hearing more about the results of these conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Denny Goldberg. I would like now to introduce Sari Altschuler, who is the co-organizer of this event with myself, and she's an associate professor of English and director of Health Humanities and Society at Northeastern University. And she's the author of The Medical Imagination, Literature and Health in the Early United States, which was published at Penn Press in 2018. She's also the co-editor of a book that I cannot wait to read, which is Keywords for Health Humanities, which is forthcoming in August from NYU Press. And this is co-edited with Jonathan Metzel and Priscilla Wall. In the spring 2020, she was an invited professor at Université Cité, and that's how it all started. And with Amy Bosley and David Jones, she chairs the Critical Health Humanities Seminar at Harvard University's Mahindra Humanities Center.
To begin with, I'd like to thank you all for being here, whether you're here virtually or in person. As Dean Poiger said, it's just a delight to be able to host things again. I'd also especially like to thank Tanya Mungia and Abhishek Sand for all of the assistance that they provided. Really, their help has been amazing just in getting everything up and running smoothly. And I know that all that work behind the scenes should have as much acknowledgement as we're able to give it. So, we'd also love to thank our funders, without whom the symposium would not be possible. We are especially indebted to the CNRS, who gave us a grant that made it possible for us to conceive of this project in the first place, along with actually the generous funding from the College of Social Sciences and Humanities here at Northeastern, who brought Sophie as a visiting scholar last spring. So all of this has just been really wonderful kind of synergy. Other people or other groups that have made all of this possible, of course, include Northeastern for hosting us and for the funds that have been allocated to Health Humanities and Society, as well as, again, for the assistance from the Humanities Center to really make this a robust gathering today. Also, we'd like to thank the Université Paris-Cité's LARCA Lab and the Person in Medicine Institute, as well as the Critical Health Humanities Seminar at the Harvard's Mahindra Center, who will host our conversation tomorrow. So that's a lot of thanks, but in part it's a lot of thanks because we feel truly grateful, and this really is the result of a lot of collaboration. Second, for those of you who are here in person, I invite you to make this shared space accessible to you. Feel free to move around. If you want to leave, come back, stim, put your feet up, take notes, or use the space in whatever makes it feel right to you. Really, the spirit of all of this is to welcome you and to make you feel comfortable. Additionally, please remember that we are hosting this symposium in English, but our participants speak a variety of languages. Our participants also represent scholars and practitioners from a variety of ranks and disciplines. So to that end, and this is a good reminder for me too, please speak slowly and deliberately, and please feel free to ask any speaker to repeat or clarify their remarks. Finally, if you're joining us on Zoom, please keep your microphones muted for the duration. One of our speakers, Chris Parsons, has generously offered to monitor the chat, and so we will use the chat function as a way to bring those of you who are on Zoom into the conversation, and we look forward to reading your questions, which you can post in the comments. Finally, my task over the next few minutes, not finally, I think all of that is in a way is a preface. My task over the next few minutes is not just to welcome you here, but also to offer some framing remarks to give you a sense of what our motivation was in hosting the symposium, but also for what we hope to accomplish. So I'll begin with those now. And apologies, I am fluent in Spanish, but my French is abysmal, so I'm going to mispronounce names, and I'm just doing my best here. I have asked for pronunciation guides and still know that I will do worse than I hope. So, in 2008, François Cousset dropped what should have been a bombshell in American academia. So-called French theory, he declared, was really American. In France, quote, Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze, and co. were not a school of thought, but simply independent thinkers. It was in the US context, in English, through US institutions, and in the crucible of US politics, that they were transformed into a movement that would overturn higher education as Americans knew it. Nevertheless, Cousset's book made barely a ripple, landing as it did precisely when a significant portion of American scholars were turning away from theory, advocating surface reading, renewed energy for historicism, and asking somewhat ironically, given that they were following another French theorist, if critique had not run out of steam. That's Bruno Latour. This perhaps explains why Cousset's big book on the American invention of French theory made so little impact. But of course, critique has not run out of steam, especially not in the American health humanities, which took off precisely at this moment, moving from a niche interest in medical schools, where it often describes something more like art therapy and appreciation, and a few undergraduate programs, to a more mature field increasingly interested in critical interventions into healthcare. It is difficult to overestimate the role that French theory played in these humanities-informed conversations about healthcare. Whether or not they explicitly acknowledge it, most are indebted to now widely distributed concepts, especially Georges Canguilhem's discussion of the normal and the pathological, Deleuze and Guattari's rhizomatic understanding of power and knowledge, and Michel Foucault's ideas about madness, biopolitics, and the medical gaze, as well as the work of more recent French theorists like Bruno Latour, who teach us about the organization of knowledge and practice in the biomedical sciences and the knotty entanglements of the narrated, the social, and the real. At the same time, this influence has traveled back to France, where American and British articulations of the health humanities and narrative medicine, and we're so delighted to have Rita Charon here with us today, have gained traction in French institutions. Starting from this observation about mutual, if underappreciated, intellectual indebtedness, Sophie, Vasset, and I began to ask questions which included the following. How have these ideas traveled across national borders? And Sophie reminded me, actually, I'm taking a little sidebar here to say that a lot of this began with the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah.
We were really interested in the ways that the French experience and the narratives that were circulating about COVID were different from the ones that emerged in the US, and it really articulated to us that these national frames were really re-emergent once more, not just with the actual closing of borders, but with new kinds of cultural frames for a new phenomenon. And so I would be delighted to talk more about that, but that is really the origin of the project. So how have these ideas traveled across national borders? How are they rendered differently, not only in different institutional settings, for example, in medical schools versus undergraduate classrooms, but in institutional settings that have very different structures, such as French versus US medical schools, undergraduate classrooms, schools of nursing, schools of public health, and others. Health humanities have long been interested in cultural differences, but how do broader structuring differences affect the shape of the field in different places? Here we began to think about things like policy difference, different healthcare funding structures, differences in health data collection, and how that affects what we can know and how we think about health and healthcare. We also thought about how differential identifications of national healthcare issues, subtle differences in the meaning of seeming synonyms for the language of health and healthcare, differences in environment, relationships to the environment, and environmental resources, and many other material structures, discursive formations, and unarticulated assumptions, in fact, undergird the development of the field differentially across geographies. In particular, we've been interested in how the tallying of racial difference in US healthcare and the prohibition of collection of racial data in France necessarily produce different conversations, something that the speakers we have gathered will address, but which is actually also what we intend to make the explicit focus of our second gathering in Paris this fall. Of course, in beginning with the US and France, we do not mean to limit ourselves to these national frames in particular, but rather seek to use our initial observations to open up what Sophie, Vasset, and I have been calling in our conversations and planning for all of this, the comparative health humanities. By comparative health humanities, we mean an approach that compares the teaching, research, and organization of health humanities across different national contexts. By introducing this idea and examining the national frame once more, we identify the crucial place that nation continues to hold in the construction and experience of health and healthcare. This is not in any way to negate the very significant and necessary strides that many health humanists and others in allied fields have made in seeking to move beyond the national frame in recent years, especially as the humanities more generally has begun to conceive of the category of nation as old or perhaps exhaustively investigated and limiting. The turn to the local and the global has produced hugely important work. Nevertheless, it remains the case that discourses and experiences of health and healthcare, more so perhaps than other dimensions of discourse and lived experience, are profoundly shaped by the state and by national culture. For example, experiences and ideas of healthcare in the United States are fundamentally structured by third-party insurance companies, while French experiences and discourse are fundamentally structured by the public system. Likewise, Americans are currently living through particular crises of reproductive health that have far-reaching consequences for questions of gender and sexuality that do not occupy French thinking about healthcare in the same way, and that's a question of policy. And the fact that one, again, cannot collect data on race in French healthcare shapes the experience and understanding of the French system in ways that are not paralleled in US healthcare. Although, of course, the system that exists in US healthcare produces its own problems, right. As I know some who will join us later in the symposium have written extensively about. These examples are not meant to be exhaustive, but suggestive, drawing attention to how, beginning from different national contexts, scholars develop distinct concerns, commitments, discourses, and experiences from which they write cannot but affect their interest in, understandings of, research in, and teaching about the health humanities. How could it be otherwise? Thus, we remain interested in the variety of scales and geographies of analysis, but find it imperative to draw scholars' attention back to the nation as the field continues to explode internationally and in a variety of contexts that differ significantly from each other and from the ones in which the original idea of the medical humanities was imagined. This symposium is an effort to begin these conversations. The topics covered over the next 2 days range in their sights from the environment to health professions to the question of translation and untranslatability to race and racism. While the discussions are largely located in the US and in France, they will touch on the impact and experiences of Chinese immigrants in French healthcare, on the problems inherent in translating the experience of disease and illness between languages, on something that Rita Charon has delightfully called abolition cognition, which we're going to hear more about in a bit, and or tomorrow, I think, and on the question of hubris, or what Guillaume Lachenal calls bêtise, in the colonial legacies of global healthcare. And of course, finally, we'll hear a little bit later on what Eram will describe as the neo-coloniality of who cares. There are lots more. I realized I had actually just written, I got so excited, I started detailing everything that you would hear, and I'm going to stop there because we are just so excited to have everyone here, and we very much hope, again, that these will be openings into a broader conversation, and we're just simply delighted to have you join us. So thank you so much, and you can clap, but I'm going to introduce people, so I'll step away. And now I'm going to come back and introduce the first panel. So, all right. Again, this is my wonderful co-host, Sophie Vasset, who specializes in 18th century studies. Who specializes in 18th century studies at the intersection of literature and the history of health. She is professor at the Université Paul Valéry, Montpellier, and a member of the IRCL. From 2007 to 2021, she was an assistant professor at the Université Paris Cité, and she's published extensively on 18th century British literature. She has a book called The Physics of Language in 2010, 18th century History of Medicine. She has a book which I'm going to describe in English, which is, the English title is Description, Prescription, Cure. That's from 2011. Bellies, Bowels, and Entrails in the 18th Century from 2017. And her latest book is called Murky Waters, and that is from Manchester University Press in 2022. She deals with the cultural history of mineral waters in the 18th century in Britain and in Europe, and she's been part of several projects in the health humanities. From 2014 to 2022, she was a member of the steering committee of the Person in Medicine Institute at the Université Paris Cité. And the spring 2022, she was here as a visiting scholar at Northeastern. Our second speaker will be Karen Thornber, who is the Harry Tushman Levin Professor in Literature and Professor of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University, where she is also acting chair of Regional Studies, East Asia, and Vice President, President-elect of Phi Beta Kappa Alpha Iota of Massachusetts. She is author of 5 single-authored scholarly monographs in the fields of health humanities, health and medical humanities, environmental humanities, gender justice and other forms of justice, transculturation, that is translation, world literature, comparative literature, and indigeneity. Those books are Narrating Environmental Distress, Stories of Ecological Degradation, Mental Illness and Inequality, which is under contract with Bloomsbury Academic, Gender Justice and Contemporary Asian Literatures, which is from Modern Language Association Publications Program in Production, anticipated 2023. Fantastically prolific. I cannot recommend highly enough her book on this very related subject that she'll be speaking about a little bit today, Global Healing, Literature, Advocacy, Care from Brill in 2020. Another book called Eco-Ambiguity, Environmental Crises and East Asian Literatures from Michigan in 2012. Empire of Texts in Motion, Chinese, Korean, and Taiwanese Transculturations of Japanese Literature from Harvard in 2009. Professor Thornber has also published 80 scholarly articles and chapters and several co-edited volumes. I actually don't think I know anybody more prolific. So it's really just such a delight to have you as part of this symposium. And she has also held a range of leadership and service positions at Harvard and well beyond. And Sophie will introduce our last speaker.
Exactly. Our last speaker today on this first panel, the first panel on translation and untranslatability, is Guillaume Lachenal, who is a historian of science. He joined the Media Lab at Sciences Po to pursue his research in global health by experimenting with methods at the intersection of biology, data analysis, and STS. Before being a professor at Sciences Po, he was a lecturer at the Université Cité and a junior member of the Institut Universitaire de France. His main research interests are the history and anthropology of epidemics, medicine and public health in the colonial and post-colonial context of Africa. His publications include, but are not limited to, the Lomidine Files at Johns Hopkins University Press in 2017, and The Doctor Who Would Be King at Duke University Press, also 2017, I think, or more, perhaps it's a more recent translation, Guillaume, you will tell us. And so I think without any transition, I will move in as the first presenter of this panel with a paper which I called Thermalisme or Spa, a comparative approach of healthcare at the margins in France and Britain. And so I wrote, because I'm going to use this word quite a lot, I wrote the word thermalisme on the whiteboard. Maybe if you can write it in the chat, that would be wonderful. Before this, however, I would like to thank Sari Altschuler, who happens to be the last person with whom I went to the restaurant just before the lockdown in France. And so, of course, our conversations would have been influenced by the experience of COVID across nations. And she has been the best co-host across the Atlantic, which was not an easy task. And I would like to thank also the Center for Humanities at Northeastern University for welcoming me last year and for all their support for this symposium, as well as the Mahindra Center for Interdisciplinary Studies at Harvard for hosting us tomorrow. The seed grant that we received from the CNRS, the LARCA, and the Parsons in Medicine Institute is meant to support the exploration of new perspectives, new collaborations between France and other countries. And this is very much the case. The notion of comparative health humanities is still at an exploratory stage, and this paper is a work in progress, and I hope that your remarks and feedback will make it progress indeed. After I presented 18th century spas at a history seminar in Paris, the organizer told me that her physician, who had tried several drugs and several treatments to no avail to relieve her of her back pain, sighed and said, "Non mais, je vais tout de même pas vous prescrire une cure thermale," which could translate to, what am I going to do? Send you off to a thermal cure? This ambiguity of the doctor's relationship to thermal medicine makes this hydrotherapy treatment an original part of French medicine, worthy of exploration as it brings to the fore specific national ambiguities in our institutional approach to medical treatment. One of the most hackneyed subjects amongst students of health humanities is the pun on cure and care, opposing chronic and acute, opposing the efficiency of person-oriented medicine and wider health governance political issues on the one hand, versus the efficacy of drug-based treatment on the other. No such pun can be made in French, although the word cure exists. It doesn't mean either cure or care, and the notion of care is actually usually translated by the term soin. Even if the etymology of the word lies in the French and Latin origin, cure, from curare. In French, the word cure is more oriented towards care, as it is mostly in the expression la cure thermale, the water cure, a long-term spa treatment with high expectation of care from the French curiste. To an Anglophone ear, this term resonates with 19th century imagery of spa towns, seaside resorts, and sanatoriums. To a French ear, une cure thermale is a reality of healthcare, even though thermal medicine lies somewhere at the margins of official medicine, prescribed to patients over 60 for persistent pain and rheumatological problems, mostly. I've been working on 18th century spas in France and in Britain for 3 years now, and I have regularly found myself caught in translation issues. There is no fixed term in English to translate thermalisme. Thermal medicine, hydrotherapy, balneology, spa treatment, mineral waters. From a British and American point of view, hydrotherapy sounds somewhat outdated, a blend of physiotherapy and comfort care. Thermalisme in France, however, has been a branch of official medicine for 7 centuries continuously, and many thermal institutions are still active today. Thermalisme is therefore a good starting point to compare questions of health and infrastructures and cultures of health as the perception of spa treatment and spa users depends on national contexts, at the crossroads of traditional healthcare, welfare policies, alternative medicine, wellness, and health tourism. Thermal medicine in France and Great Britain exemplifies how various economic and political factors shape the ways in which users of healthcare system relate to their bodies and to pain and to the space and time of treatment. And my case study today is more a comparison between Britain and France, because I'm a scholar of 18th century Britain. And so that's the heart of my work. First part then, thermalisme, cure, spa. Spa culture is forever rooted in its national health system, as I was saying. And the main contemporary differences between Britain and France lie in the fact that the water cures, or thermal cures, are covered and partially reimbursed by the French Sécurité Sociale, while the British National Health Service has no care for it. As a specialist of 18th century mineral waters, however, I would like to insist on the long historical development that have led to radically different cultural perceptions of thermalisme. In 18th century France, eau minérale was the expression in use, and the strict equivalent, mineral waters, was its correct British equivalent. The term has remained in use in France, and it has left 18th century pharmacopoeia to enter into contemporary restaurants' menu, illustrating the slow infiltration of some pharmaceutical products in our daily food habits. In the 18th century, the mineral components transformed water into a drug comparable to natural syrup or elixir. The thicker or the murkier the water, the better. Chemistry was an emerging science, much subject to criticism, and the analysis of mineral waters was deemed the most difficult part of chemistry. Doctors and apothecaries tested the waters, measuring the levels of concentration of iron, vitriol, or salts, and observing their effects on patients. Minerals and gas were considered as the main agents of these waters, which were, as I said, part of the pharmacopoeia of 18th century doctors. They actually felt like a drug, mineral waters have a very strong taste, and a visit to the Spa State Park in Saratoga Springs will powerfully convince you, I am sure. In France, you could take the waters in various sites, depending on their size. Fontaine, spring or well, ville d'eau, watering place or spa town, and later station thermale, spa or health resort. In Britain, though, mineral waters refer to the water themselves, while the place where you could get them was indifferently called spa, from the name of the spa town in the province of Liège, which was extremely popular with the British. Spas, sometimes written spas with an extra W, were very diverse in 18th century Britain, ranging from a rural spring in Yorkshire to a highly entertaining urban space, spa towns, that incorporated leisurely activities, parks to encourage exercise, bathing infrastructures, and pump rooms that were where water was drunk. Specific infrastructures were also reserved for the poor, whose use of the water was subsidized in various ways. This tradition, which later turned into the development of hydrotherapy and balneotherapy in the following century, has disappeared, and the term spa is currently associated with the widespread culture of well-being, an antidote to chronic stress and to the acceleration of modern-day living. The reason for this lies in British public health policy. The NHS stopped reimbursing water cures in the 1970s. Spa towns, even the largest one, initially built on healthcare facilities such as the hospital in Royal Leamington Spa, shifted their focus to tourism and leisurely activities. Investors banked on Cheltenham, races, Bath architecture, Buxton's situation in the Peak District. Mineral waters became a luxury feature of hotel spas, and pump rooms were turned into restaurants. Spa culture in Britain is thus strongly linked with forms of nostalgia. Nostalgia for a holier, reconstructed past with a more holistic approach of medicine. Several towns have seen local charities attempt to resurrect this glorious past. My favorite is Save Our Brine Bath. Their acronym is SOBS, and it seeks to put the spa back in Droitwich Spa. This nostalgia expands beyond the regret for earlier, more holistic perhaps, forms of medicine, and it is also fueled for the need for a holier medicine, as spas are reminiscent of a long religious history. The imaginary connection with the long-lost tradition of holy wells, which the Reformation in Britain stopped or blocked during the period of the dissolution of monasteries, has inhabited British culture from the 17th century onwards, and is currently taking the form of crowdsourcing projects supervised by online wikis or Facebook groups which seek to map the holy wells of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. Waters are found, recorded, tasted sometimes, collective religious altars are recreated. In France, thermalism is also tainted with nostalgia of a different kind, which equally relates to the long history of French healthcare. This nostalgia, carried by images of the spa and canny and its obsolescence, clashes with the active economy of thermal medicine, which seeks to reinvent itself. A new spa has just opened this year in the prolific northeast region of the Vosges, putting the medical notion of thermalisme at the heart of its name, Nancy Thermal. A name in direct contrast with older spa towns such as Aix-les-Bains, La Malou-les-Bains, Ballaruc-les-Bains. By using the word thermal, the new spa in Nancy foregrounds a branch of healthcare professionals whose specialty is regularly questioned by medical and governmental evaluation processes. Thermalisme refers to a series of medical acts that are reimbursed by the French Sécurité sociale. patients who have been prescribed a cure by médecins thermaux, literally thermal doctors, can benefit from an 18-day cure in one of the 120 licensed thermal institutions in France. French licensed spas have been categorized, like drugs, for their treatment of specific pathologies, ranging from rheumatic disease, which represents 79% of their activities, to severe skin conditions, gynecological ailments, mental illness, or pulmonary diseases. This very categorization originates in 19th century spa treatments and identifies certain mineral components as the target of certain cure, especially for skin or gynecological diseases. But the new discourse of thermal medicine tends to focus more on mechanical arguments such as the good effect of hot water or the opportunity to readjust the medical contract with patients while they are staying for 18 days. The thermal cure, in fact, is not entirely reimbursed. Patients are accommodated at their own cost and only medical services are covered. Although the majority of patients are over 67 and mostly women, thermalism is striving to develop new spas and target younger patients and new pathologies such as long COVID. We could therefore conclude that the two national contexts entail two approaches of spa treatment inscribed in two very different national health cultures. On the one hand, the French system subsidizes 600,000 patients per year and 120 now with Nancy Thermal licensed infrastructure of hydrotherapy. And this situation is inherited from a long centralized approach that has been the result of a long history since the 16th century. On the other, the British system, widely developed in the early modern and modern times, when it benefited from a thriving economy of health tourism, which dwindled down to a fraction of itself in the 1970s. This, however, becomes inaccurate if we focus on another equally valid term to describe spas, hydrotherapy. This term in English includes all forms of water, particularly seawater and seawater treatment, which was named and categorized in 19th century France with a specific word, thalassothérapie. Interestingly, thalassothérapie represents an alternative preventative type of treatment of stress and chronic pain, and seawater cure are not reimbursed by the Sécurité Sociale, whereas thermalism is. In many ways, seawater is comparable to spa water. Both treatments use hot and cold water, bathing and showers, mud and movement in the water. Yet thalassothérapie is identified as a part of the wellness industry and therefore reaches out to radically different social classes. The networks to which thermalism, balneotherapies and spas belong are therefore highly determined by national infrastructures of health, which in turn are shaped by a long historical construction of healthcare systems that justify them. Interestingly, in a conference organized with La Personne en Médecine Institute, the magistrate in charge of the Cour des Comptes report, the Cour des Comptes is the French National Budget Control Office, explained rather pragmatically why the French government was not trying to cancel the coverage of water cures. Thermalism, according to him, was not validated by the HAS, the Haute Autorité de Santé, the French National Authority for the Evaluation of Drugs and Treatments, and yet suggested thermal care should be subsidized mostly, he said, for economical reasons. It only represented 0.01% of the total social security budget, a justified state investment to allocate to the maintenance of economic dynamism in small villages, to the permanence of health services in rural areas with a growing doctor shortage crisis, recurrently called medical deserts because of a rarefied accessibility to care. To this, Thermal doctors and patients replied that the magistrate in charge of the report was not recognizing a central question, which is crucial to the teaching and research of health humanities, efficacy. These waters saved my life, even said one of the patients present. They were referring to the Sojan spa, a spa that specifically targets patients suffering from mental illness. And this expression strangely echoed what the early proto-feminist writer Elizabeth Robinson Montagu said of the Tunbridge waters in 1756. She said, "I believe I owe my life to their assistance." Spas are a good starting place for a debate about the relativity of efficacy, and more specifically about the place that needs to be made for relief in incurable diseases and chronic pain. The great majority of patients who get a prescription for a water cure are suffering from a certain and ever-changing experience of chronic illness. Take my historian colleague from the beginning. Her physician did not resolve to prescribe a thermal cure, and she still struggles with back pain. By reimbursing water cures, the French Sécurité Sociale might also be validating the needs of people suffering from chronic pain and their persistent search for relief, for lack of a better cure, and for the desperate absence of a quick fix. Thank you. We can now share the PowerPoint.
I think that's good, yes.
There we go. All right, perfect. So, thank you so much to Sari, to Sophie, to Guillaume, to Northeastern University for hosting this symposium. I'm just delighted to be here with you today and to share with you a bit about my work.
Okay, you do have a clicker?
Yeah, there. Okay, this one. Oh, okay, great. Thank you. Okay. Right, so my talk today is titled World Literature and the Health Humanities, Translingual Encounters with Brain Disorders. So we'll start off with this question of translation and untranslatability. For those of us in literature in particular, the term untranslatable has received significant attention in recent years. I'd like to think about how this concept might translate into the health humanities, how it might not. Translation, of course, has been a central part of my own work for many years. Some years ago, I published a translation of a Japanese language anthology of atomic bomb literature, atomic bomb poetry. To say that was challenging is quite an understatement. So translation and how you get from one language into another, to put it in very basic, simple terms, really complex concepts, complex understandings, experiences, and so forth, has long been top of my mind. So Sari mentioned briefly and very kindly one of my recent books, Global Healing, Literature, Advocacy, and Care. And in this book, I talk, among many other things, about various translations of literatures on health, healing, illness, and so forth. For instance, I look at some Urdu language translations of a Korean language novel on leprosy and think about, how the concepts relating to leprosy, treatment of leprosy, particularly stigmas against leprosy in the colonial period in Korea, early 20th century, post-colonial period as well, how these are translated into Urdu in Pakistan, which of course is a very different type of place. Today, though, I'm going to be talking about translation in a very different sense, and one that to me is even more interesting because it's not maybe looked at quite as frequently. I'm going to be thinking of more of translation of experiences, and in this case, dementia, or more broadly, traumatic brain injuries. So as most of us here know, dementia cases are rising rapidly globally as the population ages. The same is true, not necessarily can correlate with aging, but traumatic brain injuries also are on the rise. They're quite high due to falls, vehicle-related collisions, violence, including gender-based violence. We hear a lot about sports injuries causing traumatic brain injuries, and of course, combat injuries also can cause traumatic brain injuries. Literature from around the world is full of attempts to transcribe, to understand, to articulate the experiences of those suffering from traumatic brain injuries, their families, their caregivers, their loved ones, and so forth, as well as medical professionals. And if you look closely at these works, sometimes you don't even have to look too closely, you see right away the arbitrariness of how these conditions are described, pointing to just how readily and often quite unintentionally patients can be pigeonholed and misunderstood. So in the time I have today, I'm going to do just one case study of this. This is based on the Japanese writer Ogawa Yoko's 2003 novel, Hakase no Aishita Tsushiki, which translates literally as Equations the Professor Loved. The book, however, has been translated into English as The Housekeeper and the Professor. And some years ago, my husband was teaching at Northeastern and taught a Japanese literature course, and he assigned this book and said the students really enjoyed it, really resonated with them. So that's part of why I feel particularly privileged to speak about this book here today. Also, of course, fits very nicely with the theme of our panel. So anyway, this is my case study. So a bit about the background of this book for those unfamiliar with it. Basically what it is, it's a first-person narration of a woman who is employed as a housekeeper, caregiver more broadly, for a mathematics professor who some years ago, some decades ago, back in 1975, sustained a traumatic brain injury in a traffic accident. The professor's memory of events before the accident, 1975, is intact, pretty much intact. But he has only 80 minutes of short-term memory. Eventually, as we get toward the ending of the novel, even these 80 minutes disappear as the professor loses his short-term memory altogether. Then you have the final few pages of this novel, which cover the professor's last decade. He's in a long-term care facility, visited frequently by the narrator and her son, who he's nicknamed Root. But most of the narrative, about 90% of the narrative, is this woman talking about her experiences caring for this retired math professor. So this novel does many things. One of the things it doesn't really do, though, is probe the dynamic of people refusing to listen to patient stories of illness, or people sidestepping these stories, as we all know, is quite common in many works about illness. There are a lot of works about illness. I talk about many of them in Global Healing, which are very much about how we do not listen to patient stories, how we don't even try to understand, or if we do, we come in overly with our own biases and so forth. That happens in this novel, but not really so much. What is much more at the forefront of this novel is the attempt of this woman, the narrator, to relate to an individual living with traumatic brain injury, who both has, as mentioned, a very severe memory loss, short-term memory loss, but who also is very reticent to talk about anything except for mathematics and baseball. And it's actually very interesting because this novel is full of mathematical equations. So if you're looking at translations of the novel in scripts you don't know anything about, you still will recognize those mathematical equations. It's actually quite uncanny. That being said, that's there for a reason, right? Because the professor is always talking about math. So he's talking about math and he's talking about baseball. He does not want to talk about himself pretty much ever, even though the housekeeper, the narrator, is very kind to him and gives him opportunities to do so. He's very clear he doesn't want to speak about that. So how then, as caregiver, someone who comes to think quite fondly of the professor whose son develops a very strong relationship with the professor, how then to understand his experiences? And the novel speaks to this, to the challenges and possibilities of understanding, of communicating with, and of caring for individuals who are physically or emotionally unable to speak about their own experiences with illness. And emphasized throughout is the importance of being empathic and sensitive to the well-being of others. Okay. So the novel, even in just, say, the Japanese version, is inconsistent regarding the professor's condition. It provides conflicting information on the state of his overall memory, how his short-term memory functions, the condition of his mind and brain, and his lived experience. The professor's condition, even in the Japanese version, is interpreted in multiple ways, even by the same person. So even in the same novel, looking at the same narrator, she'll describe his condition, his experiences in different ways. Things get even more complicated when you look at the many different translations of this novel. And I've just listed a few of the translations here. It's been translated quite broadly to Catalan, Chinese, Dutch, English, French, German, Greek, Hebrew, Italian, Korean, Malay, Persian, Slovenian, Spanish, Swedish, Vietnamese, and probably others that I just couldn't lay my hands on. I went to a lot of effort to try to amass as many of these translations as I could. And one of the, initially, it shouldn't have been, but initially it was quite surprising things, is that the differences in these translations really can't be attributed to differences in culture, as sometimes is the case. What I mean by that is, say, the difference between the German translation and the Korean translation, they really don't stem from differences, or at least differences I could find, between German and Korean attitudes toward brain disorders. As mentioned, this is somewhat unusual, right? When I was looking at translations of the Korean novel into Urdu, a lot of the changes that are made by the Urdu language translator, you can kind of understand if you're familiar with the cultural context, the historical context in which the Pakistani Urdu language translator is working. Very different. Different things take place in translations of the equations. And what these translations really did for me is they underscored the fundamental subjectivities and even capriciousness, in some cases, I'd say, the capriciousness at play in labeling and describing people and conditions, particularly those who cannot speak for themselves. So Ogawa's novel suggests, and its many translations emphasize, that more caution is needed in speaking about these conditions, and that more care needs to be given to grasping what patients most want and need from caregivers and society more broadly. And I'm going to give a few examples. I go into this in much more detail in a chapter I wrote in an edited volume, edited by two of my colleagues, Professor Diana Sorensen and Professor Homi Baba. The volume is titled Territories and Trajectories, Cultures in Circulation. And in this article, I look at 7 translations of the Japanese language version. There are 2 Chinese language translations, English translation, French, German, Italian, and Korean translation. And I look at the different ways in which these translations describe the professor's medical condition and his experiences with this condition. So all of the versions, at least all the versions I looked at, agree that the professor's memory of events before the car accident in 1975 remains intact, but that now he has only 80 minutes of short-term memory. Again, a condition brought on by the traumatic brain injury he suffered in the car accident. So all the versions pretty much agreed on this. But the versions differ in the interpretations of the implications of this condition. And again, these divergences are not there because of various cultural differences. They highlight instead, I would argue, the arbitrariness of conditions and of how we describe conditions and how we categorize people. So for some examples here. So the translations really vary on the state of the professor's overall memory. Does his memory simply have problems? Is it impaired? Does it not work at all? For instance, the Japanese says that the professor's overall memory is impaired. The Korean says doesn't work. The Chinese version, one of them says memory has problems, another of them says it has defects or flaws. And some of these are pretty close to synonyms, but there are definitely nuanced differences here. And the English, or I think it's the German version actually, says his memory lets him down. Okay, it's adding that subjective perspective there, which really isn't there at all in the Japanese. There's also the question how the professor's short-term memory functions. In the Japanese version alone, the short-term memories are described as piling up and then collapsing. At the same time, they're also likened to an 80-minute videotape that appears automatically and smoothly to record new memories over old memories. So how you get from collapsing things to smoothly recording, re-recording, I wasn't quite able to figure that out. I think that's sort of the point. In other words, the professor's described as having both a long-term memory that's very much intact and an incessantly changing or collapsing pile or tape or tower. Very confusing. The translations tackle this passage in a variety of ways. Generally, they liken the professor's memory to a videotape that every 80 minutes records over the previous 80 minutes. That's pretty much consistent. But otherwise, the translations differ. But how they talk about the memories disappearing, right? But how they disappear is another matter entirely. Do they just evaporate? Do they collapse? Do they crumble into a million pieces? The Italian has the memories shattering. The French has them being erased immediately. One of the Chinese versions has the memories trying to accumulate one on the other. The English and the German have the memories just simply not working. It's very confusing and very inconsistent across versions. Two other examples here. The condition of the professor's mind and brain. In the Japanese version, it translates literally into his mind has not yet gone soft. The German, Korean versions say he's not senile. In the French, he's doddering. In the Italian, he's demented. And I think it's in the Korean where it's on the whole, he's healthy. Then in another version, the brain cells are not completely healthy. So again, it's kind of all over the place. And finally, the lived experience of the professor. What is it like to live with a memory that does what has been purported to do? Is the professor suffering? Is his condition experienced? Does he experience it as an impairment, an inconvenience, an impediment? There's a lot of reference in the Japanese to, compared with a person of, quote, normal memory. But in English, that becomes he is part of or not part of the world of normal memory. Those two things are quite different. In German, he's not in a normal world. In the French and Italian, he's handicapped, and so forth. So, how can we even begin to understand this individual's lived experience? There's so many different ways in which it is interpreted. So just a few concluding thoughts as I wrap up here. In a recent article on his brief episode of anterograde amnesia, the American journalist Trip Gabriel asks, without our memories, who are we? Gabriel goes on to comment, the ability of the mind to hold short-term recollections and to retrieve longer-term memories and the feelings they evoke is essential to being human. Well, I can tell you, I teach this passage and my students just revolt because I think I've taught them well or they just come in knowing this, but this is just not true, right? I mean, I think the equations in so much literature of illness, of health, of healing, and so forth brings this across quite well. The equations, just for one example, depicts life continuing quite meaningfully and productively, albeit with great difficulty, after traumatic brain injury. At the same time, Ogawa's novel and its many translations throughout the world highlight the pervasiveness of diagnostic instability, and they caution against both rushing to judgment and assuming to know fully the experiences and needs of another person. And I should say right here that the narrator of this novel never assumes that she understands everything. She's always second guessing herself. She's quite a sympathetic figure. But even she has a lot of difficulty, trying to understand the professor, trying to meet his needs. Unlike many translations of literature on illness, the translations of Ogawa's novel give insight not so much to differences and tensions among cultures, among linguistic communities, as happens in a lot of translations. Instead, I think they provide greater awareness of what it means to care for individuals who cannot speak about their experience, regardless of what cultural context we find ourselves in. I think the translations also can give us good insight into the fundamental importance of learning to appreciate people's experiences, however they're communicated, and never forgetting their humanity. And that's something that comes across very strongly, both in the Japanese version of Equations, as well as in the many translations. So I will stop there and turn it to Guillaume. Thank you very much.
I don't think he is. I think he will just speak.
Okay.
So you need to stop sharing.
The first one. The first one.
Hello, everybody. I'm trying to share a screen rapidly. Should be working.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. Okay, hello, everybody. Thank you for having me at a distance. I wish I could have been more present, but it's my last week of teaching this term, and it was not possible for me to come. Speaking of teaching, I recently received some anonymous assessment of my first semester course on epidemics and planetary health. And one student complained that my lessons were long and boring. Fine. But he also mentioned that it was a mix of English words with a French accent and French words with an English accent. But he did not say that was unintelligible, but he clearly complained, but he had a talent for the punchline. But it's just to say that translation and untranslatability in medical humanities is a topic that is dear to me. And that I find stimulating. Another joke to begin is I don't know if the joke is as famous in the US as it is in France, but it's a classic joke on untranslatability. It's not a joke, it's actually, I think, a real story of George W. Bush. I don't know, when was it, 15 years ago, complaining to, or 20 years ago, to Tony Blair about the French. And he famously said that the problem with the French was that they did not even have a word for entrepreneur, which is a word, and maybe he knew it. In that case, he's a genius. But in a way, we could transpose that remark to the French did not even have a word for medical humanities or global health or triage, also a concept that we rediscovered in French. It's a French word that we rediscovered in French medical humanities with my colleague Céline Lefève, that came to France through English-speaking critical global health literature. And we didn't have, and we still don't have a word for big pharma, for example. So in my reflection on untranslatables, I obviously here draw from Barbara Cassin, the French philosopher, definition of what is an untranslatable and why is it so important to attend them and to translate them and to attempt and fail and reattempt at translating them. In my case, the first untranslatable of medical humanities that I wanted to attend is in a way hidden in plain sight, and it is the concept of evidence-based medicine, which is especially the English word evidence, which is present in the medical and scientific literature well beyond actually evidence-based medicine. Evidence is sometimes translated into French by the word evidence with an accent on the E in the French word evidence. And it's quite often the case, and it's also quite frequent that in the room there's a kind of a brotherhood of people who are annoyed by that Anglicism, because we should not translate the English evidence for the French evidence. And more correctly, evidence-based medicine, for example, is translated by preuve as which gives médecine fondée sur les preuves. But evidence, the English evidence is clearly an untranslatable because preuve does not carry, obviously, the full meaning of evidence, and preuve is a more mathematical and logical definition of evidence that would translate back, if I'm correct, into proof. But I like this bad Anglicism that is still prevalent today in France, because it actually points to a problem that is maybe haunting modern medicine and modern doctors, which is the problem of stupidity. Let me explain this. In French, the word evidence means what is obvious. An evidence, something that is evident, is something that is obvious to the point that it does not actually require any explanation. When you say c'est évident, as you say, it's obvious, there is even an element of irritation or aggressiveness. You say to someone that something is evident. Something is evident, it's so obvious that thinking is actually no longer needed. And that something is evident, again, means that it's true simply because it's true, and one should not ask questions. So what I find interesting is that the bad translation of evidence-based medicine into la médecine des évidences, or la médecine fondée sur l'évidence, then means in French medicine based on what is obvious, medicine based on a knowledge that is so straightforward, so stunning that it does not require any thought, which means quite literally stupid knowledge. Which then brings me to my second favorite untranslatable in the medical humanities, which is a near synonymous, but not a synonymous of stupidity, but which is centrally which poses centrally also the problem of evidence, is the French notion of bêtise. The problem of bêtise, the French word, and I will explain what it means, occurred frequently in my work, which is a work, my work is, I am a historian of global health, and also at the same time a historian of colonial medicine and post-colonial medicine, and a historian of the link between the colonial past and the global health present in a way. And it is a research, it is a field, an empirical field that poses many issues relating to language and meaning and translation. And to try to expose you this issue that studying global health and colonial medicine poses, I would say that global health, we all agree, is a field that is desirable, that is often strikingly serene. It's a field that is cool in a way, and whose benevolence actually prevents us from asking any question in a way. And this complicates the task of criticizing global health, which is again a realm of benevolence, people helping saving the world one problem at a time with pragmatism and enthusiasm. Who can be obviously against that, and who can criticize it without sounding stupid? But the problem is that global health also brought the art of platitudes and evidence in a way to a whole new level. So to illustrate a more materially this challenge, I often use the example of an important speech in the history of global health that produced important material effects, which is the keynote lecture given by Melinda Gates at the Malaria Forum in 2007. A keynote speech that was the launching of the Foundation's program to eradicate malaria. Of course, eradication seemed and still seems like an unreasonable goal in the case of malaria. It's definitely an ambitious and audacious, as Melinda Gates said, goal. But the Gates Foundation explained in that speech with poignant stories and images, the Gates Foundation explained the need to have no other goal, I quote, than eradication. And Melinda Gates based her speech on a simple theorem. The death of a child from malaria is unbearable, while especially because treatment exists. It's unbearable, but those treatments are not available due to the disastrous state of health systems in Africa. But, explained Melinda Gates, since health systems are not among the things that we can change, there is only one solution left: to eradicate malaria. That's a pure illustration of what evidence in French means, common sense. Health is good, illness is bad, bad health systems is bad. And this common sense, this evidence, allows then all logical boldness, including a complete inversion, I think, of the realm of the possible, which is improving access to primary healthcare, and the realm of the impossible, the eradication of an infectious disease. To paraphrase Melinda Gates, it is because nothing can be done against the disease that it must be eradicated. It's better to prevent than cure, evidence-based medicine with a French version of evidence. Another instance, another example of that problem of global health use of form of I don't know how to term it. I don't want to use the word stupidity, but what I want to insist on is that my critique of Melinda Gates should not be taken as a form of Americanism, like an Orientalism that would project equate global health with America's philanthropy and suggest that there's a specific problem here. It's a problem that is more universal than that, of course. And here is just an image of our latest Nobel Prize in medicine, Luc Montagnier, discoverer of HIV during one of his tours of Africa. But I like this picture because it evokes, it can inspire a way to criticize global health that would not be only a critique of its politics or of its unfairness, but a critique of its comic potential. And that's why I like this picture. But the other example, which I studied a lot in the field of global health, is the whole mobilization since the early 2000s against emerging viruses in Cameroon, which is my field work, and especially the very enterprising work of a global health entrepreneur named Nathan Wolf, who called himself the Virus Hunter. But Nathan Wolf's work was, to me, very revealing, because the key concept of his work was to prevent a pandemic before they started. And it's to me a very and the success of Nathan Wolf makes this vision very important also to analyze and criticize. Nathan Wolf loves a statement like this one. Typically, it's important to stop pandemic before they start, because critically, what happens in Central Africa doesn't stay in Central Africa. And he was thinking of HIV or Ebola, for example. So it's important to stop pandemic before they become a pandemic. And I really delved into that statement, because it's a very interesting statement. Of course, why don't we avoid? It's actually stupid to not avoid pandemics, and it's important to avoid them. And one could note, of course, that a pandemic is defined by the fact that it has spread through the world. So there's maybe a logical weakness here in the statement, in a statement like that. But you know that this statement is now part of the post-COVID policy globally. We now all agree that it should be a priority to stop pandemics before they start. And in the dominant framing of that question, the idea of stopping a pandemic before it starts, again, a pandemic is only a pandemic when it has spread globally. There's no pathogen that is a potential pandemic in itself, but that totality is lost to most virologists, apparently. But this statement, leaving aside the fact that it's maybe absurd in terms of epidemiology, and leaving aside the fact that it reduces the question of pandemic to the biological potential of pathogens to spread, and it leaves aside totally the ecological conditions that favor spread, which is also a convenient framing of the question of pandemic when you're a biologist, but maybe not a reasonable framing from a public health point of view. But again, these statements, we should stop pandemic before they start. What is interesting in it is that the problem is not that it's false. The problem is not that it's morally wrong. Of course, it's in a way a good statement. But the problem is that it's obvious to the point of aggressiveness. And that notion of something that a truth that is true to the point of being paralyzing and aggressive is what precisely we term easily in French, and in French my speech would have been much clearer, as a bet. The problem with Nathan's slogan is that it is bet, which is not stupid. I have no notion absolutely of how long I have talked so far, but I think I need to wrap up now, but with a call to
5 minutes.
Sorry?
You have 5 minutes.
Okay. Okay. So this my inventory of medical betties was not limited to the critique of contemporary global health in its most securitized version, but was also, to me, an important question when studying the history of over-eradication programs, this time in the past, that have also been promoted by very loud colonial doctors. And especially the program I studied is the use of that drug Lomidine during the 1950s to eradicate sleeping sickness. And here again, a similar kind of statements dominated the literature to justify the massive use of that drug Lomidine in Central Africa. And it was the need to eradicate, and eradication was justified by the fact that eradication was a good thing. Most of my work consisted in tracking the many deaths left by that insistence to conclude with sleeping sickness, that insistence to end with the last mile of sleeping sickness eradication, which is the story of the 1950s in Central Africa, and which is a story of very concerning and broad medical accidents. So inventory of bêtises, the inventory of public health stupidity in that case is also a question that very much matters, and that is not only a problem of armchair criticism. To conclude, what I wanted to expose here is how an untranslatable term like bêtise can be perhaps mobilized, and mobilized also collectively as we compare across obviously a national context and across epochs. I wanted to present you that untranslatable term because it is such a rich term in terms of French theory. In a way, bêtise is a very classic philosophical problem in French, and a very difficult to translate aesthetical and philosophical problem that has been essentially defined by the literary work of Flaubert, especially in Bouvard and Pécuchet, his masterpiece that devotes an entire chapter to a specific form of stupidity, the specific form of bêtise that is present in the medical treatise of the 19th century. So there is an affinity between stupidity, modern medicine that was exposed by Bouvard and Pécuchet, but what is interesting in Flaubert's work is that obviously bêtise can never be named. And you've understood that the big challenge in using that term is that it immediately hit back on the one who uses it. And the ironic presentation I gave of Melinda Gates or Nathan Wolff is obviously very risky, because pointing the other's bêtise is often a risky way of being pointed back for one's own bêtise. And the solution of Flaubert was to invent a formal device, that is the writing of Bouvard and Pécuchet, to expose bêtise without naming it and without pointing at it, which is a task that is maybe impossible, but I think incredibly stimulating for us and for medical humanities to be able to expose medical bêtise or medical evidence. I leave it here.
Thank you. You're here, so
Maybe Karen, we sit here.
so you'll sit here. Okay, so we have about 20-25 minutes for questions from the audience, and also Chris Parsons is going to be monitoring the chat, so we'll have questions from the chat as well. If you're here virtually, please feel free to write your question in, and we will do our best to have this be as hybrid as possible. So would anyone like to begin? Yes, please.
Hi.
And please introduce yourself and say where you're from. Yeah.
I'm Rosemary Jolly. I'm the Chair of Literature and Human Rights at Penn State University. I just wanted to, I have three questions actually. The first one about the spa. I'm just wondering if there is a piece of colonial, decolonial, post-colonial history there in terms of the wealth available to construct the culture of the spa in the 1800s in Britain. It seems to me that there would be a real need to look at the development in relation to, slave labor and the ability of that to underwrite the ability of a middle to upper class to be able to access the spa. And then I wanted to just talk about the sorry, I'm struggling with. I know what I'm going to say. There's got to be something different between difficulties of diagnosis and the sort of irascibility, that's not the right word, but the kind of the range of the large range of translatability, because, and I'm not even talking about the difference between signify and signified. I just want to give a quick example. When I was working on HIV in South Africa prior to the rollout of HIV/AIDS, the government used the term in isiZulu, Nkulazi, okay? But for a long reason I won't go into now, the rural population never identified that because they have only one term for all sexually transmitted infections in the rural areas, which is Iklondo. So they couldn't identify with the public health campaign. So I'm just talking about the range of difference, but I wouldn't want to, that seems to be a slightly postmodern move to collapse the kind of range of possible translation with the effect of the range of that translation on diagnosis. And then in the last one, I really enjoyed Guillaume's talk. And I just want to point out that Pi and others have really critiqued from the other side the very construction of global health in terms of its quote unquote benefits and colonial approach, right? So I think we have to go to Pi and that's part of the argument I think that you're making. Pi and Abimbola's article that suggests that global health goals will only be achieved once we have got rid of the idea of global health as the ultimate sphere of donors and beneficiaries.
You know what, could we ask you two to come up a little bit just so that the people on Zoom can see a little bit? Yeah, I think even just, facing, is this, perfect. I think, all right, we're trying to accommodate the way that the cameras face. So, and I'll try to get you on here as well, so please.
So, briefly about spas, yes, there has been some post-colonial work done on spas, especially Eric Jennings, who wrote about France and spas in the 19th century, and he wrote a book called Curing the Colonizer, which is a wonderful book which explains how not only did spa develop, so in France, not directly on slave labor, but in France, with money coming from the colonies, with lots of Orientalist buildings. If you go to Vichy, for example, you'll see that the new bath of Vichy is very Orientalist, and there are many. There is definitely a colonial culture in spas, but also in the colonies, how spas were some kind of a medical hubs that the colonists went to also be treated or to have some kind of prevention treatment against exotic diseases. So there's this is a great book, but there is also current investigations being made. I'm thinking of the work of Amanda Herbert and the Jamaican spas in early modern times, and how they were developed also in relation with slavery. And I think she's really she's currently writing a book called Waterworks in early modern Britain, and it's definitely one of her objects of investigation. And I would say also within Britain there is a relationship to spas within the several countries that constitute Britain, to which Britain, it's the English have a colonizing relationship, such as the relationship between England and Ireland, and how Irish spas were strongly associated with the Catholic tradition, and that was also part of a discourse and a colonial relationship. So yes, definitely.
Yeah, so thank you. Great question. If I understood correctly, you're asking for distinctions between the range of possible translations, and I didn't quite catch this.
And that's the fact that range of translations is not the same, but contributes to notions of diagnostic accuracy.
Okay. Yeah,
So in other words, I just don't want the kind of sort of mobility of signifiers in untranslatability to be collapsed into being the same as an accurate or an inaccurate diagnosis.
Right. And
although they have effects, they're not on the same thing.
Yeah, no, they certainly do. And I think that's a really good point to make. And I guess all I'd say to that is that in the translations I was looking at, it's not so much correct versus incorrect diagnosis, right? Because the diagnosis stays the same. It's how we understand the experience of the individual. And of course, who has the diagnosis, right? Part of it, what's happening in the translations that I brought to the fore today, happens, I don't want to say with any translation, but with many translations, right? Translators take liberties. Some of the liberties have direct connections, very obvious, explicit connections to differences in culture. Others just artistic choice, and there's kind of the whole gamut in between. I think, though, what really struck me about this, about what I was finding in the different translations, is that, first of all, they're translating a book that itself is so ambiguous into what precisely the professor is experiencing, because you hear his voice, but you only hear his voice mediated through the narrator, and secondarily, what he's saying has to do with mathematics or the narrator's son. Like, he's very insistent, even when he's suffering from this awful toothache that gets so bad he can't eat. He doesn't say a word, and the narrator notes that, oh, he can't eat anymore, and then she figures out he has a toothache. So that's how reluctant he is to talk about himself. So it's all stemming from that. But then you get these translations where it seemed almost that translators themselves were trying to figure out, what is this individual experiencing? What is the memory structure like, based on what I know? So it's almost as though they're in the room, with the narrator, but much more importantly, with the professor, the retired professor himself, seeing what's happening, visually what's happening, and then trying to understand what that means, translate that, as it were, into words. And so that's what really got me about it, because it was so different from what I usually find when I'm studying translations. So I agree, though, with your initial point that we just can't collapse everything together, and we have to be really careful about what we're doing here. But I'm just speaking of this one particular example. But I think if you went and searched similar works, you'd probably find something similar going on. So because you see it in the initial texts themselves all the time. So, thanks, great question.
Yes, thank you. I mean, just perhaps I could say a word about these critiques of global health and this investigation into the colonial framings of contemporary global health. And just what I would say is that it's interesting to see this from France, where critique of global health, and it's been also true during the pandemic, is often framed with this Orientalist construct of global health as something that is English speaking, American, and not ours. And so I think that's a difficulty, especially for an academic critique of global health from France, to not or to problematize that Orientalism, because it also falls into a critique of global health as cosmopolitanism, to which we oppose a French tradition that is also a colonial tradition. So that's where things got complicated, because in France, in a way, colonial medicine is sometimes presented, and the type of relation that France had built with Africa through colonialism and also through decolonization is presented as an alternative to neoliberal global health, to say it rapidly. So there's an interesting supplementary challenge here in the critique of global health.
Perhaps mediated by the experience of Algeria.
Yeah, perhaps. Yes.
Thank you.
I think I saw Eram and right?
Hi,
Oh, and
my
introduce
name is
yourself.
Eram. I am an assistant professor at Harvard in the History of Science department, and thank you all for your wonderful presentations. I have a question for each of you. So, Sophie, can you talk about the role of nostalgia in this spa a little bit more? For Charon, my question is, so can you get a sense of how care regimes are also getting translated through these kinds of texts? So you talk about how the illness is people are trying to grapple with that, but then kind of the flip side of that. And then for Guillaume, since you just taught your planetary health course, I was wondering what your thoughts are on that as a concept, if you see that as having some kind of potential that global health doesn't.
So thank you very much, and nice to meet you. I'm looking forward to listening to your paper. Nostalgia and spas, I think they have so many encounterings. One of them is the actual place. Spas are spa towns, places where time seems to have stopped, and that people go to also to enjoy this experience of fixed time, whether it's fixed in the Georgian era, like Bath, or in the 19th century, like Vichy, or in like more, even if there's this wonderful book of pictures of sanatoriums and spas in the Soviet era. Again, there's a notion of fixed time there in between the 1930s to the 1960s, where you see a whole aesthetic, because they're often built as in more or less in one go, like as a system around healthcare. So I think that's one of the aspects of the spas, and because spas work in seasons, there is also the off-season representation of the spa, which gives a sense of nostalgia and the uncanny. Again, this is a very aesthetic approach. But then, as I explained, I think that there is a nostalgia for a form of care that was given in spa treatment, whether it's more holistic, whether it was giving more time for the patient to adjust to the treatment and to undergo a long cure, for the isolation that spa provided, but also for a blend of some form of religion and healthcare. That would be, I mean, I'm going to stop here, but I think nostalgia and spas work really well, and there's a lot to say about it. Thank you for your question.
And thanks for the question. It's wonderful to meet. I'm glad we could meet here. Just shows you how busy we all are. Yeah, so great question. Yeah, so care regimes, I don't, in the book when I analyze this narrative, I don't talk about care regimes in Housekeeper and the Professor, but they're very much there. So it takes place in Japan, which has a culture very much of, you know, looking out for relatives at home, particularly aging relatives at home, as much as one can. Of course, you know, with shrinking birth rates and people living longer and longer, this ideal is not often matched with the reality. In this particular narrative, what's happened is that the family, the sister-in-law decides that the family can no longer take care of this individual themselves. So that's why the housekeeper is hired. And there's a real distinction made throughout the narrative of the family kind of wanting to commit this individual to an institution, and the housekeeper being very much about, you know, she's fine, she's managing fine. He doesn't actually require that much care because, until the last, 10 pages or so, which admittedly cover, the final decade of his life. And so, in line with that, it's actually a real shock, and that you don't really see this coming in the narrative, where he goes downhill pretty suddenly, and he's institutionalized. And it's very interesting because the housekeeper herself, who's never identified, she never gives her name. She's become so attached to the professor that she doesn't realize just how much his condition has deteriorated. So it's this very uncomfortable irony of the individual who's so close to the person being taken care of that they don't recognize that he really needs much more care. So there's that dynamic. The novel focuses a lot of attention on the relationship of the housekeeper's son and the professor, showing those, relationships between the elderly and younger individuals, and how beneficial they can be for both. But interestingly, it doesn't really get into dynamics of long-term care facilities, unlike other works of Japanese literature that come out really harshly against institutionalizing. Even if it really is in the best interest of the patient and the family, there's still quite a strong bias, and that comes across really powerfully, not in this work, but in other works.
Yep.
So what should we do with planetary health? I think it's a very good question. On the one hand, I think it's a step. It's a step towards what I would call, maybe with more affection, more than human health, an understanding of health and disease that is close to what environmental humanities, environmental history, and also most of us historians of epidemics, especially in the field of African studies, have done, which is to attend to disease, and at the same time ecologies, histories, and landscapes, etc. So my initial response to the planetary health proposal was very enthusiastic, and then as I see it now as an academic enterprise, whereas social science and humanities have very little space, it's really it's less attractive. Clearly, it's a very depoliticized way of thinking together about the environmental crisis and global health. So there's also there's enthusiasm and disappointment at the same time from my perspective. But I think I still do with the term, even if it's challenged, by over over theoretical propositions such as eco-health, etc., etc. But so far, I find it good enough, but with caution.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm Simeng Wang. I will present in the next session. I'm from CNRS in France. So I have a question for Charon. I think it's really interesting to see to what extent all these different versions of the translation go beyond the cultural differences, and they tell us the way that the translators will interpret the social reality, right? And I'm wondering, have you studied who are these translators? I mean, are they male or female, and to what extent they are familiar to the Japanese society reality, and have they been trained in care and I don't know health humanities? Because I used to be a translator for the Chinese families attending the mental health monitoring in the French public health facilities. So I did reflect for myself on the social condition of the translation. And it's true that when we translate, they are always a part of the subjectivity of the translator. So I just want to, maybe you can tell us more about the social conditions of the translation and the protection of the words in the translational settings.
Yeah, so I wish I had done more research on this when I was doing research for this article a few years ago. What I can tell you, though, I didn't do this in a systematic way, either for the translations of this narrative or other narratives. But what I can tell you, because I just from a broad sort of overview, is that the translators who I did look up and sort of follow down the rabbit hole, because I was really curious, like, why are they translating particular scenes, particular ways? I mean, this becomes even more interesting, like in the translation of the leprosy novel, Yi Chongzheng's Paradise, I was talking about a moment ago, where things really get transformed. I'm wondering why, where are they coming from? And it's really fascinating. I mean, so a lot of the books I talk about in global healing have been translated into Urdu, and the reason, or the Korean language one's been translated to Urdu, and there it's part of a project of this one Urdu or Pakistani-based Urdu language publisher, Mashal Books, to get, quote, like the most famous Asian books into, or East Asian, and other non-Western titles into Urdu. And so they're picking some of these works in Korean as well as Japanese and Chinese and so forth, not because of anything to do with health or healing or anything like that. It's just they think these are some of the most prominent titles. I wouldn't necessarily agree. I mean, I'm glad they think they're some of those prominent titles. I think that's a very subjective choice, but be that as it may. So no, they're not being chosen because it's about health. And I think certainly for Ogawa Yoko, she's a very prominent Japanese writer. She's written on a range of themes, a range of topics, and health is just one of them. But your question actually gets to, I think, a really important point and something I would want to investigate further. Namely, if you have individuals translating these texts who themselves are deeply embedded in health humanities, or if they have some experience with caregiving and so forth, are they somehow translating these works differently based on those experiences? And probably yes, but I'd hesitate. Mostly what I found from the translators is they weren't so interested in the health part. They were interested more in, like, these are key texts in such and such. There are many exceptions, of course, but thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Okay, please.
Hi, I'm Gordana Brenner here in the Department of Sociology, and this is about spa. And I can testify that as a child I got prescribed to go to a spa for a treatment. So I'm from former Yugoslavia, and we do believe in terrorism. But my question is about gender, because in my family, this is anecdotal evidence, that many of my grandmother and my mother and other members of my family went to a spa for treatment. And I thought it was, going on a vacation alone, it's not like something you do. But if you go for a medical treatment, that's allowed. And so, did you find anything about gender and health and, legitimacy of women going alone?
Yeah. The answer is yes. There's a lot to say on the very long history. First of all, I'm not glad you had to go to a spa as a child, but I'm glad you're mentioning that it can be a treatment for children. I didn't have the time to read an excerpt of a book that was advised to me by Céline Lefève, who's called Une chance folle. And it's the story of a young child in France who gets burned at a third degree. She has to undergo a lot of treatments, and one of them is going to a spa. And the way she describes the spa treatment is ghastly. Like, it has nothing to do with well-being, and even the place feels very much like an old sanatorium, and the treatment is painful. And because it's a water that's supposed to help, improve the burn, and it echoes 17th century description of Madame de Sévigné about Vichy, which is once again a ghastly experience of undergoing spa treatment, which, just to mention that spa treatment is not just agreeable. But to come back to your question about gender, yes, it was indeed a possibility to go alone on a spa, and there has been many studies about 18th century women who would have the possibility to meet in the spa on their own. And in fact, there's a literary scholar who also showed that it was almost an imaginary place for the blue stockings. The person whom I mentioned, Elizabeth Robinson Montague, was regularly going to Bath or Tunbridge Wells. She was meeting friends there, and spas were offering this possibility of connection, or what also Amanda Herbert, whom I mentioned earlier, called female alliances. And so I would say the early modern and 18th century time, it's definitely a possibility. There is the long history of treating women for infertility at the spa. So that's all a gendered prescription and visits of spa. But I think men were definitely not excluded from spa visits, especially as gout was also very much a target of spa treatment. And gout was in itself gendered in its approach, representation, diagnosis. And it turned then into rheumatological complaints. So there's, a long history of gender spa treatment. Thank you.
I think we're actually 5 minutes over. So we will thank everyone, and then we will reconvene at about 3:40 for the next session to give everybody a chance to get coffee or do whatever else you need to do. So thank you so much for and
Stop
stop sharing. Thank you. And can you also spotlight?
Got it.
Yeah, and can you spotlight me as well so that I'm gonna have so that people can see the face of the speaker?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
You need to open the video.
Oh, I need to open my video. Sorry.
Have to put your video. There we go. There you are. She's right there.
There. Okay.
You're there.
Okay, great. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone, to the second session of our Comparative Health Humanities Symposium. If you're just joining us, again, we're doing our best to make this a hybrid event. Part of what that means is that we have asked people to speak a little bit slower and more deliberately, but also we encourage questions, clarification, repetition, all of that is great. We have people who speak multiple languages, come from different disciplines, etc. So that is all very exciting. Also, in the spirit of the hybrid format, we're asking those of you who are joining us remotely to post any questions that you might have in the chat. We do have another speaker, Chris Parsons, who is going to be monitoring the chat for us. Finally, we are very excited about this panel, and but I do want to say that Patricia Williams sends her regrets. There was an unfortunate scheduling conflict, and so that we learned about. So she will join us for the second part of the symposium in Paris. For those of you who are joining us either in person or virtually for that this October. All right. So without further ado, I'll introduce the first speaker. My co-organizer Sophie will introduce the second speaker, and then we'll get underway. Our first speaker is Eram, who is an assistant professor in the Department of the History of Science at Harvard University. She specializes in the history of medicine, with particular emphasis on globalization, race, migration, and health during the 20th century. Her first book, The Care of Foreigners, explores the enduring consequences of post-colonial physician migration from Asia to the United States from 1965 to the present.
And the second speaker for this Racism, Migration, Colonialism panel is Simeng Wang, who is a permanent research fellow at the French National Center for Scientific Research, CNRS, and a faculty member at the CNRS, which is a research center on medicine, science, health, mental health, and society. And since 2009, she has been working on Chinese migration to France. Her scientific publications include Chinese Migrants in Paris, The Narrative of Illusion and Suffering, another one called Chinese Immigrants in Europe, Image, Identity, and Social Participation. She has led many research projects. I will just quote two. The first one, Migra Chai COVID, is a project investigating on Chinese migration in France facing COVID-19. And the second one was about the discrimination of racism experienced by people of East and Southeast Asian origin in France. She is also the coordinator of the research network on East and Southeast Asian migration in France, and the scientific curator of the exhibition East and Southern and Southeast Asian Migration to France in preparation, and I can't wait to visit it. It's going to be in October 2023. All right, thank you very much.
Hello, thank you all for being here. Thank you to Sari and Sophie for the organization, the invitation. I very much appreciate it. I'm looking forward to the conversation. So I kind of have a cheeky title, which is the neo-coloniality of who cares. And I hope you'll see why as I go through this talk. So I'm going to modify slightly just to make sure that I am clear and set this up correctly. So I'm trained as a US historian, and I focus a lot on the post-1965 immigration regime in the United States.
And so today I'm going to give you a different interpretation of one of the major pieces of legislation that kind of marked US immigration history, which is the 1965 Hart-Celler Immigration Act. So I'm going to read this act through a different lens of physician migration and specifically post-colonial physician migration. On October 3rd, 1965, beneath the Statue of Liberty, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed this Hart-Celler Immigration and Nationality Act into law. And during the ceremony, he reminded the American public, I quote, "This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill. It does not affect the lives of millions. It will not reshape the structure of our daily lives. Yet it does repair a very deep and painful flaw in the fabric of American justice. It corrects a cruel and enduring wrong in the conduct of the American nation." So I hope you hear in this all of these negatives. This is meant to assuage the fear that immigration reform generally elicits within the American populace. And so that's the work that he's trying to do and trying to mark this as a symbolic piece of legislation. But he really underestimated one of the important ways that this bill was revolutionary and would significantly reshape the lives of many. It changed the composition of the US healthcare workforce by expediting the entry of foreign physicians to provide care for millions of Americans, excuse me, in rural and urban areas, specifically throughout the United States. These physicians completed their medical education in country of origin and arrived ready to provide medical services as generally interns and residents. Between 1965 and 1975, over 75,000 foreign medical graduates, and I'm going to call them that not in a derogatory way, but that was a historical actors category at that time, and that's also the term that often my interlocutors will refer to themselves as. So these foreign medical graduates came from predominantly post-colonial Asian nations, with South Asia representing the largest numbers. And like I said, they came to work in underserved areas throughout the country. So this Hart-Celler Act really marked a symbolic shift from this previous immigration legislation of 1924. This was the deep and painful flaw to American justice that Lyndon B. Johnson was referring to. The 24 policy was restrictive, it barred Asian immigration to the United States, and it was very isolationist in its orientation. And it went counter to the US Cold War political and economic objectives of that time. So as the global superpower to emerge after World War II, it was incumbent upon the United States to showcase these new ideals of global and social and economic interconnectivity. So in this talk, I focus on the critical period in the 1960s when debates over doctor shortages, so this crisis that we also heard Sophie refer to earlier, were refracted through these Cold War anxieties to produce an immigration arrangement that prioritized physicians in nations, physician migration in unprecedented numbers. It bolstered the US healthcare workforce in ways reminiscent of colonial practices of labor management and value extraction, thus blurring these temporal and spatial boundaries between colonial and the post-colonial world. Analyzing this migration with attention to these local crises in physician supply, alongside these geopolitical concerns, makes clear this interdependent relationship between US healthcare infrastructure and foreign policy. So by expediting the immigration of skilled medical labor, policymakers signaled that there was a place for the post-colonial foreign physician in the democratic bastion of the world. They could provide healthcare in America's disinvested communities. So all of this was really marked by the Cold War moment. This moment is a time of global reconfiguration, politically, economically, and most importantly, ideologically. Anti-colonial uprisings in Asia and Africa combined with these proximate memories of fascism and the ongoing nuclear arms race, occupied political imagination. And amidst this precarious Cold War moment, foreign physicians imagine this are now entering into the United States. So for individuals of Asian origin, immigration has always been racialized and intimately tied to questions of political economy. And I can talk more about this in Q&A. So the Immigration and Nationality Act of 24 that I referred to was the most comprehensive bill prior to the 65 Act. And it had two sections. One was the national origins, which was a quota restriction, and the other was called the Asian Exclusion Act, which is exactly what it sounds like. It was a zero tolerance policy towards Asian and Arab immigration. One of the representatives who was looking at this bill when they were talking about reform explained, quote, "The 24 Act cut the flow of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as from Asia, and at the same time offered favorable opportunities to members of what were then referred to as the Nordic or Aryan races. Call this what you may, it is nothing less than racial discrimination," end quote. So like I said, the Cold War really prompted scrutiny of this 24 Act because there was this fear that these newly independent post-colonial African and Asian nations, they were the sites of these ideological Cold War battles, and legislators understood immigration as a proxy for foreign policy to be a useful weapon against communist encroachment. So it was a way of having these kinds of political relationships and perpetuating these colonial dynamics and circulations under a new guise. So I argue that opening immigration was an important route to also establish these transparent connections and to create networks of information also to monitor and surveil potential threats. So in other words, migration policy emerged in the breakdown of the colonial world order to maintain spheres of power and to contain decolonization. So if you charted a specific route, then you could know exactly how and where people were moving. So in the years leading up to the Hart-Celler Act, legislators only feebly gestured towards immigration reform. And finally, one of the co-authors of the bill, Manuel Celler, he really disparaged these small shifts, and he considered immigration reform to be the last bulwark against this vital commitment to equality. So his argument was that in 1964, all of the civil rights legislation was passed and getting talked about, and immigration should be fully a part of this kind of conversation. And he tried to convince people by making the argument that the post-1965 immigrant was a potential American temporarily housed in another land, quote, due to the accident of his birth. He asked, quote, "Shall we not as a nation have the means whereby we can choose freely from all corners of the earth the talents and the skills we need and not limit our choice because one man of genius was born 5 miles east or south of an arbitrarily traced boundary," end quote. So his rhetoric signaled this kind of shift in immigration policy towards a new wave of, in his words, genius elite immigrants, deserving of a kind of unrestricted movement possibility who were welcome to the United States as now potential Americans. So the sponsors of the act really were excited about this selective immigration with preference categories as a pragmatic approach to reform. Because these things would do this change would do two things. One, it would erase the foreign policy stain of restrictive immigration from this 1924 bill. And two, it allowed for the United States to address these specific labor shortages, especially during the Cold War, so they could quickly attract scientists, engineers, and physicians. These were the categories of laborers who were preferential and were really at the top of the list. So this new immigration legislation was attracting an elite laboring body that was contributing brain power that the United States urgently needed. So two lines of argumentation, one largely macroeconomic and one microeconomic, persuaded lawmakers to pass this bill with large majorities in both the House and the Senate. The macroeconomic position framed the US as passive recipient versus active recruiter of immigrant labor. They were a mere bystander to the inevitable demands of the post-war global economy. And little attention to asymmetries of power were part of this kind of explanatory frame. So the Secretary of State at that time explained this perspective, and I quote, "We are moving into a scientific and technologically sophisticated period of our national history, and there's going to be plenty of room at the top. We're drawing on other countries because they have the talent and the background, which makes them extremely helpful in our society here. There is an opportunity here for those who would like to take up their lives with our own. We are in an international market of brains. This is not a case of intentionally going out to rob," end quote. So in the Secretary of State's analysis, science and technology were the actors responsible for charting these new paths and routes, and nation states were simply responding to these kinds of inevitabilities. So posited in this way, incorporating intellectual manpower was less about political maneuvering and more about universal knowledge production. And this sentiment was especially shared by medical school deans who were also invited to this congressional hearing. And specifically about physicians, one argued that they should, quote, "have freedom of movement to any country where they can be maximally productive in answering problems that are not unique to a single country, but are problems of the world. So we should never interfere with migration of this category of health personnel," end quote. So they continually maintained that sickness and health are universal problems without regard to geographical contours of nation states. So any understanding of this in one country would eventually just diffuse to all other places in the globe. And so by adopting this position, they had an alibi. They were able to dismiss the accusation that America was unapologetically pilfering top talent from less developed nations. So the macro version of the argument framed migration using this sterile language of global resource allocation and optimal efficiency, and the microeconomic position centered individual choice. In the most diplomatic iteration, an economist explained, quote, "Professional people with a readily marketable skill like medicine are highly mobile on the international market and should settle to maximize personal gain." In this assessment, this economist continued, he said that part of the problem was that these immigrating professionals would be more inclined to remain if, quote, "there was an increased receptivity to change in their sending countries. This new elite human capital refuses to accept the traditional values and power relations. It's an ambitious, able, impatient, and above all, mobile class. And it searches out the social environment receptive for innovation." And he argued that part of this problem was that there's a mismatch, and it was a consequence of the ex-colonies, their hubris. So he explained, quote, "India, like most ex-colonies, apes its former imperial master by teaching the same curricula the same way, without attempting to adapt its educational product to local needs and without adjusting for its different economic development. Most of the less developed countries, because of national pride or self-delusion, insist on producing high-level manpower in larger quantities than foreseeable demand." So he sets up these places in an impossible bind, because they should modernize to retain their professionals and develop their economies, but their development should also consider their differential economic development. So this is a very confusing position to be in. Although this act garnered much support in Congress, the hearings leading up to the vote and in the years following, there were hesitations percolating below the surface. In '68, there was a brain drain hearing, and one congressman asked his fellow politicians, quote, "Does it not follow that the countries to whom we would look for the skilled specialist would feel that we would be draining off their best people, those whom they want to keep, and wouldn't this give rise to some feelings which would not enhance our relations with these countries?" So his comments, I read them as an attempt to reintegrate the political and ethical aspects of elite migration into a debate largely framed using free market logics. In the years following, individuals willing to articulate this position grew, and one of the most vocal advocates was Senator Walter Mondale. He wrote, quote, that we should need doctors from countries where thousands die daily of disease to relieve our shortage of medical power is inexcusable. To him, he called this a national disgrace. Allowing elite labor's permanent residence in the United States compromised the United States' quote, commitment to development by depriving new nations of high-level manpower indispensable to their progress. It runs counter to the education and training we provide in our foreign aid. So this foreign aid, end quote, this foreign aid came in the form of development grants for education and training that were considered part of the vital long-run objectives of American foreign policy. He continued, quote, American security depends on development in the less developed countries, development at sufficient speed to satisfy at least a portion of their rising aspirations. So just to sum up, he's trying to say, we're essentially the money that we're putting in, we're recuperating in the form of this elite labor. And what's going to happen is this is actually going to run counter not only to these labor demands, but to foreign policy objectives. This is not about some kind of equitable distribution of healthcare resources, but this will cause foreign policy tension. So although his criticisms seem progressive in comparison to his peers, he said it's routed through this foreign policy and recognition that the chaos of post-colonization required careful and deliberate management. Aid was a part of that. Educational grants were a part of that. And bolstering development at a certain kind of pace and rate was also a part of the US's geopolitical dominance. Economists estimated the dollar value of the manpower being deprived through immigration to the United States was, quote, approximately equals the total cost of all of our medical aid, private and public, to foreign nations. He laid the facts bare. He said, quote, importation of medical skills is much cheaper for us than developing our own facilities, end quote. Because the expense of developing new facilities and the time required to train a physician were so significant, foreign physicians offered a cost-effective and timely solution to doctor shortage. So in this, I really hear what anti-colonial thinker Kwame Nkrumah referred to as neocolonialism, or the last stage of imperialism. In his analysis, aid was, quote, merely a revolving credit paid by the neocolonial master, passing through the neocolonial state and returning to the neocolonial master in the form of increased profits. This is the title refers to this idea, this kind of circularity of economics that's happening here. In other words, the U.S. is granting medical aid and recuperating the investment in the form of educated, skilled professionals willing to provide care in America's disinvested communities. So in 1977, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare prepared a report on the state of these physicians in the country, and they concluded, quote, based on the current data, physicians migrating to the United States each year represent about 1/4 of the annual output of all medical schools of the world outside of the People's Republic of China, the USSR, and the socialist countries of Eastern Europe. So when we hear this, we can't not think this is there's something happening with the Cold War and the movement of people right here. So in this assessment, geopolitical influences and implications of physician migration are very difficult to ignore. U.S. significantly benefited from this floating labor force of post-colonial medical professionals trained in different contexts with significant need. And despite efforts by countries such as India for a brief period of time to thwart this directional movement, the pull of the United States was far too strong, and it continues to be far too strong. So I want to just conclude with a few thoughts. Since the Hart-Celler Act of 1965, immigration has become a requisite method of procuring adequate physician labor in the United States, resulting in foreign physicians constituting at least 1/4 of the labor force since that time, if not more at different periods. So no longer this kind of temporary Cold War fix, foreign physicians have become indispensable, especially in certain areas where doctor shortage crises have become a regular feature of the healthcare system, also making us rethink the notion of what crisis means. The most recent example is COVID. When all of the borders were closed in June 2020, Trump issued a proclamation suspending entry to any aliens who present a risk to the US labor market. And there was one notable exception: healthcare professionals able to provide, quote, medical care to individuals who have contracted COVID. They were welcome to enter the country. The proclamation authorized the State Department to issue mission-critical visas to foreign medical physicians. Confronted with this national emergency and inadequate health workforce capacity, the United States once again recruited foreign physicians to alleviate this deficit. So I want to end with, but should this be the case? Should the United States, the world's superpower, continue to recruit post-colonial labor instead of building and investing in its own infrastructure? In 2010, the World Health Organization urged its member states to consider the ethics and effects of these kinds of market dynamics and to adopt a global code of practice on the international recruitment of health personnel. The code was published in response to this unidirectional recruitment practices flowing from the developing, quote, to the developed countries, and it argued that this movement is exacerbating global health inequities. The code urged developed countries to coordinate recruitment strategies to mitigate the negative effects on the health systems of, these are all WHO words, of developing countries. And most importantly, it advised that developed countries, quote, strive to meet their health personnel needs with their own human resources by strengthening their educational institutions to scale up the training of health personnel. So what this code makes clear is that in a globalized world of vastly unequal market power, domestic decisions in the United States reverberate globally. A shortage in the United States begets crises and shortages in other countries. And if the pandemic has made anything clear, it's that building a sustainable healthcare workforce is the foundation of any kind of global preparedness.
So thank you so much. Thank you, Sari and Sophie, for invitation and organization. It is a real pleasure for me to be here. So today what I will present to you is a piece of ongoing work focusing on the professional practices of healthcare workers of Chinese origin in France during the COVID pandemic. So it's a perfect transition after your presentation. And of course, the general context of migration is very different because it's not Chinese population in France. They are not really came in the post-colonial or colonial context. So we can discuss more during the Q&A. And so I previously sent you a book chapter on which my talk today is based on. And this chapter is included in a collective book, which is one output of the research project that Sophie, you previously introduced, which investigates living conditions of Chinese migration in France during the COVID. So our team is basically a social scientist, composed of the social scientists, but we also have some journalists and one filmmaker in our team. And I will not go into details of the migration COVID project, but I just want to introduce you the methodology and the data. For this project, we mobilized the mixed methodology. So For the quantitative part, we conducted almost 100 semi-structured interviews with 106 people of Chinese origin, but coming from the very different social backgrounds in terms of the generation, but also in terms of the professional occupations and gender distribution and age and so on. And for the quantitative part, we carried out online questionnaire, and we have received almost 400 completed responses. And here, I think it's not, we can just skip this part, but I want to say that actually our online questionnaire respondents, they are mostly young, female, and educated. So we can also just keep that in our mind for the discussions. And here on this slide, we map out the residential locality of our participants. So without any surprise, most of them, they are living in the Parisian region. And here I want just to mention the whole economy of the book, and so that you can maybe better situate the book chapter that I will present after in the general context, landscape of the whole project. So the book is structured around 3 sections, and first one is really related to the everyday practices and daily lives of the Chinese people in France. So we have one, for example, one chapter about the media consumptions, another one about the preventive measures among these people of Chinese origin, and also the level of the stress, mental health, and anxiety of these people, and also about the food behaviors and so on. And the second section is more kind of focuses on the very specific Chinese population. For example, we have one chapter related focusing on the elderly people, elderly Chinese, and their social tie, how the social tie goes beyond the local and national levels, and they are definitely transnational, and how they will remain the social relationships with their relatives living in China, for example. And we have also students, Chinese students in France, and some undocumented Chinese migrants who have received the food assistance during the crisis. And Chinese entrepreneurs. And then we arrived on this last section in which I just highlight the book chapter. And this section analyzes more on the citizenships and the social mobilizations, and also all the how the Chinese people, they are related not only to the host countries' social life, but also to the Chinese societies. And we have one chapter analyzing the anti-Asian racism, but we have also another last chapter 12 is about the how the Chinese people and Chinese diaspora, they're really engaged in the transnational sending of the masks, and also the all the medical facilities between both countries. And now let's focus on the Chinese health caregivers. And of course, my reflections is embedded in the general landscapes of researchers on the health inequalities exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, and so across the world, including France, and also another series of the researchers. They are focusing on the how to deal with, so how the policymakers and also how the housekeepers they will cope with the pandemic, so in this general context, I ask myself 2 questions. So the first one is, do Chinese people mobilize medical and paramedical resources coming from China? And second, what are the roles of the health professionals of immigrants' origin faced with the COVID. So now I will just take 5 minutes, and I invite you to see a very short teaser of the documentary that we produced from the project. So, the teaser is untitled in English, so you can just read the. They're kind of which one? Ah, there is a okay. I can't really. I will stop. Yeah, I see the problem because I want to show you also the sound of the video.
I think share computer screen.
Yeah.
Mute the microphone
Yeah.
and then go into settings and then share computer screen, and then we will hear it. They will hear it, but there will be no feedback. Yeah.
Okay.
Why
so
don't you go
okay,
do it
yeah.
for
Can you
her?
can you
Yeah,
yeah.
go do it.
Sorry.
Sure.
So if you click share. Okay.
Yeah. Share. And
This one.
And someone needs to do something on that.
Okay, partager le son document.
Okay. Okay. I will do that.
Okay, sorry. Zoom teaching skills.
Est-ce que vous avez déjà entendu parler atteints au sein de la population d'origine chinoise? Si oui, est-ce que vous pourriez nous raconter un petit peu de ce que vous savez, vous avez entendu dire?
Du coup, j'ai entendu d'un ami proche qu'il avait eu, enfin, que son père avait eu le virus. Du coup, là, il a dû. Du coup, son père, il a été hospitalisé et il a
On était en Chine, on est revenu et d'un seul coup, j'ai appris de mon système de mail dans la filière médicale. On a en fait notre système de mail avec les échanges par MS Santé en fait. Donc on reçoit officiellement les lettres d'avertissement, les lettres de notification du ministère de Santé par exemple. Et c'est de cette façon que j'ai appris. Je viens de quitter une région qui est en train de monter une épidémie de Covid.
当时是国内的一些数据，如果你要翻译成英语，再翻译到英语的期刊上，那还需要2到3周的时间。但是我当时得到的一手数据的话，我当时就很快的就把它翻译成法语，把它转到了法国卫生部。那么在很早的时候，大概从12月底到1月份正式开始，到2月份这段时间，那么所有从国内来的这些消息，包括无症状感染者，包括他这个消化系统的一些表现，那么包括这个 CT 然后的敏感性这些，那么其实当时还没有 BBB 也还没有在文章上出现的时候，其实这些信息我已经把它转给法国卫生部了，也转给了像法国最早治疗的像 BJ 还有 BSA 这2个大的这个感染科中心，他们其实都已经收到了这样的一些信息。
Dès que je repris en fait après les vacances de Noël, je suis masquée. Je me mets sur blouse avec en fait la protection comme un astronome et ça a beaucoup effrayé les visiteurs, même les clients des autres collègues. Je ne veux pas dire qu'ils se moquent de moi, mais ils ont trouvé que c'est un peu exagéré. Ils ont dit bah, c'est une épidémie assez éloignée, mais vous croyez vous protéger comme ça serait efficace. Je leur dis bon, je vous laisse votre choix. Mais moi, je sais ce que je vais faire, et moi je pense que c'est très nécessaire, peut-être on va devenir comme ça après.
在这个疫情发生以后呢，我是紧急被调派到这个巴黎急救中心3日。那么在我的工作的业余时间呢，然后我们组织了这个华人热线， 那么华人热线也是由我向巴黎急救中心提出申请，那么来组建的。我们是一支就是由会说中文的这些法国的医生或者是医学生，我们共同组成的一个团队，来帮助大家。
就网络上我们建立了另外2个群，就是叫新冠可医群。那么我就开药方给他们，因为其实那段时间我这边药也很缺，那么就是让他们去巴黎不停的找药，或者是送我寄药。不过那个时候就是这种原因，我大概也成功治愈了100多人。
像我们医院的话，他们在可能3个月之间，反正我们一共是走了将近1/3的老年人。然后当时特别惨痛的一个现实的状况就是，整个法国啊，不仅是93，当时是很少有医生，他们都非常非常繁忙的。然后当时医生已经，因为一般有老人去世的话，医生会来做一个constat de décès，然后去证明在这个证明上证明他的去世的原因。然后当时这些医生已经非常的已经 débordé 了，所以他们就是非常下意识的，就是重复性的就放那个suspicion de Covid。
C'est plutôt en fait d'une période tendue que je veux pas en fait de rester à vie comme ça, les masques, sans contact avec des gens, de rester toujours vigilance. J'ai trop peur qu'un jour j'ai zappé. C'est pas parce que j'ai peur de l'attraper, c'est un jour, si j'ai attrapé, je risque de la filer à tout le monde, à tous les gens que je consulte. Alors, de cette inquiétude de fond toujours en moi, il faut rester vigilant, donc ça m'a épuisée en fin de journée. Quand je travaillais autant, la fin de journée, je retrouve en fait le corps complètement vidé, la tête ne tourne plus. Donc ça, c'est une situation assez courante à l'époque quand il y a des conflits.
Okay, I see the time is flying, so I will try to summarize very quickly the main point of my presentation. So I will just share. Go back to my PowerPoint. Actually, to be brief and to approach this question of how the health worker of Chinese origin are engaged in the community-based solidarity and care for Chinese people in France, I typologized 2 kinds of care for. So the one is from inside of the French health care system, with mostly the contribution of biomedical physicians, such as the case of the Dr. Na and the Dr. Lei, the 2 first cases you saw in the teaser. And another kind of care for is from the margin of the French healthcare system, such as the CAM practitioners, with the Mrs. Tsai, who is the Chinese medicine practitioners, or community-based care promotion and other kind of disseminations of the information about the COVID virus and how to protect yourself, all these kind of initiatives. So the first kind of the sorry, so I just moved to the so the first one is the case of Dr. Na, and second one is Dr. Lei, and the third case is this Chinese medicine practitioner, and the last one is about all the, of course, for this very special form of the care for Chinese people, the Chinese government is engaged, and this is really from very high level to the, it's not from the subaltern or the rooted initiative. So we can discuss also how the different actors and they are of course engaged in the different will, especially also in terms of the political opinions. They could be also collaborate, where we can see, observe the different places with the different initiatives, and we can discuss later. The first, I want just to conclude. So the first kind of the care providing is institutionalized, and it's really the formal system of the French care system. And the second one is more subterranean and informal, organized, or coming directly from the Chinese embassy in France and operated through the Chinese diasporic policies. So we see that from above and from below, and these two directions, they are locked between them, and I hope this paper delivered few empirical elements for rethinking the ways care should be provided to people of immigrant backgrounds beyond the Chinese one, and I think there are at least three dimensions of care could be highlighted. The first one is the care work itself, which is very gendered, and we saw that all the figures, they are all female. And the second dimension is about the care organization, and here I want to just outline and highlight the potential that from my fieldwork, this potential for co-constructing intersectoral systems of actions, particularly between the medical sector and the social sectors. So how the care and cure are totally intersected. And also this potential in terms of the care of the organization in French society, and this possibility to build medical pluralism. To combine the biomedical approach and all the CAMS approach. And the last dimension of the care that I want to, it's more like inviting you to think with myself, it's about the care ethics in terms of the policies, politics of the care. So to open the discussion, and I did the exercise so related to the how comparative approach could be possible. So here on this slide, I just want to ask you and ask myself if what's the reality in the U.S. society. During the same period and among the Chinese population in the U.S. to the Chinese, origin practitioners were health givers. They are they have been involved or not in this kind of care for the Chinese people, and I try also to find some differences between these two national contexts. And on this slide, I just started to write some very preliminary ideas. So of course, if you have any insights and any thoughts on that, that's very more than welcome. So thank you so much.
Perfect. I'm sorry. You know what? I think Rita hasn't spoken yet, so Rita then respond when Sarah. Yeah.
So I have a question for Eram. The situation today is as ghettoized as it has been in the past. And as you know, a physician from anywhere in the world cannot just come here and practice medicine. They come, they have to do an observership, they have to go through ECFMG certification, and then they have to do 3 years of residency in a hospital. The neurosurgeon practicing in India has to come and start all over again and be an intern and a resident. And of course, there's a dramatic status gap between the places where, and we still call them FMGs, foreign medical graduates, are able to train. So we're in worse shape than we were before the Call Seller Act.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and we saw it operationalized in something like the pandemic, which just brings to relief these kinds of care chain dynamics and the global scale of these kinds of things. And you know, it's why I inserted a question in this question, in the idea of crisis, because these things are continually called, oh, there's a doctor shortage crisis, but in fact, if crisis is the state of the system and it's designed such that you will always have this same exact situation, then I think we have to start analyzing it with different kinds of terms, because I think what you're saying is exactly right. These dynamics haven't changed. Labor is still considered cheaper from elsewhere.
Exactly.
There's still a hold on the number of physicians that are trained in the United States, so that a status and is maintained in terms of that professional capacity, the salaries, et cetera. So there's a lot of incentive to maintain this kind of system.
Right, but it's intensified because the graduate from another country cannot train at the high status. They don't get to train at the Brigham. They don't. They train in like small community hospitals down south.
Yeah, and then they move into slightly different neighborhoods, and then a new cohort
That's right.
continually comes and takes that spot. Yeah. I have no answers. I'm sorry.
So I just wanted to comment on that, and I was wondering whether, you know, as a Global South scholar, when I come into that picture, especially in the 1970s, I'm thinking not only of the picture here, but the fact that if the US had ever been submitted to what it was, along with the International Monetary Fund, demanding of other countries in terms of the structural adjustment program, it would have created if one can even undertake that thought experiment, one can start to see what is going on in terms of the movements that you're talking about. So that it's not only a question of who gets served, it's what are the structurally violent conditions. Yeah. So that's number one. And number two, I just wanted to come back and make a proposal. I really enjoyed our second speaker very, very much as well. So thank you to both of you. And in that case, I just wanted to say that my experience of working in HIV comparatively in Indigenous communities in Canada and then in South Africa tells me that the tolerance for what has always, since the pre-apartheid era, been recommended in in South Africa, which is the interdisciplinary cooperation between biomedical and traditional healers, such as izingoma, is much more encouraged when there's no immediate biomedical response.
Right.
So when you, which is really bad, because it means that when you start out in KwaZulu-Natal prior to the rollout of highly active antiretroviral therapy, they tell you to go home and die in your village, which means the sangoma then completely takes over. And that was literally a quote from a patient. I was told to go home and die, and then the sangoma takes over because they're much more better at confidentiality and so on and so forth. But then the ability for this izangoma to get respect after the introduction of heart and after the introduction of nevirapine and so on and so forth, even to keep or to bring in pregnant mothers for nevirapine, just it goes from high to nothing. So I think we have a lessons learned here, where there has to be a continuance of integration as the biomedical knowledge comes in, because it has to do with the slant. I mean, I'm sure Rita can speak to this, but with the prioritizing of, you know, medical knowledge here, social science like the doctor, the nurse, and then the humanities is the cherry on top, or the just, optional extra.
I totally agree with you, and I think COVID provided a very special case and showroom of this possible integration between the camps and biomedicine, because there were no immediate vaccination possibility or other biomedical solutions.
I think Karen and then Chris and then Kim. Yeah, please.
I have questions for both of you. Wonderful talks. Just really excited to learn more about your work. So, first for you, I'm so curious. First, about how the U.S. compares in this dynamic with other, wealthy.
Canada.
Canada, for instance, different European nations, France, for instance. I don't know, so I'm really curious about that. And I also wonder, what about the reverse? So physicians who train in the U.S., maybe not for medical school, but other parts of their training, and then go elsewhere, either back to their home countries or other parts of the world. How does some of the dynamic, in other words, greater contextualization? And Simeng, I just love your presentation as well. It's so ironic. I'm teaching a course now on diaspora, and we're doing Chinese diaspora in a lot of quotations tomorrow, and the students have been doing readings that really challenge this term diaspora, and we have students of Chinese heritage who declare they are not part of any diaspora. They're really objecting to this term, and of course that has a whole complex history and migration studies and academia and all that. What I would love to hear a little more from you on, though, is, of course, Chinese diaspora is so just broad and diverse, and many languages, many kinds of backgrounds, and so forth. So I wonder if you could speak a bit to that. What is the Chinese diaspora in France? How are different dialects handled, different ways of understanding health and so forth? And then also, how do the experiences of Chinese immigrants, individuals of Chinese heritage in France, how does that compare to other foreigners, particularly Asian foreigners in France during COVID? Thank you both. These are great papers.
Sure. So thank you for that. The question of other countries, there's a large movement, especially because of the colonial ties in South Asia to the UK. Canada is a big sending country, or receiving country, sorry. South Africa is also a big receiving country. Overall, though, the United States is the largest magnet and continues to be the largest magnet. A lot of the reasons for that, I think, have to do with the lack of a national healthcare system and the amount of money that people are able to make in these spaces, but the trends predominantly the United States. These other places definitely have huge cohorts of the NHS. There are many, many studies that are fully, primary care in the UK is handled by foreign physicians. Any kind of rural medicine in Canada is handled by foreign physicians.
Mostly South African.
But the just absolute term numbers, the United States is the largest receiving country. And then as far as reverse migration, especially from the United States, one of the things that happens with these physicians when they enter into the U.S. labor force, and as the panel on translation and translatability, one of the chapters that I think about is how do people actually get translated? How do you create a global commensurate supply of labor? But what ends up happening is that they come here and they just sort of get diffused within the U.S. system, and there isn't a lot of data about reverse migration. So there's just been some kind of guesses about what's happened, but largely it seems like the majority of people who come to the United States end up staying in the United States. Because once you do that process of translating yourself over, which is so effortful, as Rita pointed out, there's, I think, a lot less incentive to enter into a different space.
Except for elite clinics. I mean, I'm thinking my own experiences living in Asia, where I was always told, well, go to this clinic or that clinic because they have, physicians trained and so just, I guess that's a very, very small
So there, I think it is a pretty niche.
Thank you for your questions. It's very a good point about the different uses of the term and how the different actors within the Chinese population in France they will position themselves towards this words, this term, this notion of the Chinese part of the Chinese diaspora. So it's true that, for example, to describe this population, we have the even different terms in Chinese and also in English and in French to use. And it's true that, for example, the Chinese overseas, the term overseas, it's created and used by the Chinese government, the overseas. And some our interviewees, they resist to this kind of term using. It's just one example, but it's definitely we found some tensions between the Chinese government's will and to control and to govern this kind of global governance of the rights of the states towards the Chinese population living in France and the very ordinary citizens and Chinese people, how they will describe themselves and how they will also report their their ordinary relationships to China. Simply. So you are totally right. I mean, the Chinese people in France, it's definitely high, diverse, and heterogeneous groups, and we can divide it that into the different subgroups according to the of course the context, the historical context in which they decided to emigrate, leave China, for example, during my PhD work, which is really focusing on the social suffering of the Chinese people in France. I met a group of the post-Tiananmen refugees. So their suffering is really is highly politicized. And which is not at all the case for the Chinese students, where the recent Chinese students were the highly skilled Chinese migrants just immigrated to France after the Beijing Olympic Games, for example. So it's the social realities and also the China's development and Chinese rising totally. I mean, the time changed. So the people they are also as individual they are engaged in the very different geopolitical stakes. So so of course all these. Macro contexts, they do, of course, impact how the well-being, mental well-being of each individual as migrants living in France as migrants. And I just want to go back to your last question, but I think we can keep discussions during the dinner and tomorrow, and which is about
and in Paris.
Yeah, and in Paris, of course, during the next years, and which is about how the Chinese people they compare the Chinese people with other Asian background migrants, and it's true that it's highly different, and once again, it's embedded in the big history of the world. I mean, for example, in France, one very big Asian community. They come from the east Indochina, and in terms of number, they are more biggest. And it's true that to think about this group, of course, the colonial and post-colonial context and the theoretical framework is really indispensable. And but if we compare the Chinese people with the Japanese origin or Korean origin, is another reality. I just give you example from our another collective research on the anti-Asian racism, and we collected empirical data among the different, Asian origins and Asian nationalities. And it's true that we found, very interestingly, there is social hierarchies within these Asian people. For example, the Japanese people, they are not really in the denial of the anti-Asian racism. They do recognize this social phenomenon, but they definitely think that they are much far from this reality, and they think the anti-Asian racism is something for Chinese people, for Vietnamese people, because they come from the developed country and so on. So it's really complex, and I think we need, just to pay attention to this diversity, not only within the Chinese population, but also within the different, racial, ethno-racial minorities in the French society.
Thank you for both these papers. Eram, I was fascinated by the phrase like brain drain and presumably brain gain, and especially because I know about earlier regimes of immigration where it was just like obsessed with immigrant bodies and trying to kind of unlock hidden defects or genetic and I'm just curious, like, how prevalent that framing of these people as kind of mobile brains was at that time. And Simeng, I have a weird, because for a variety of reasons, I've gotten to know a number of ginseng growers in America, and I'm just curious about the supply chain issues for drugs, remedies, and the effect that had. Because I know, like, for people I know, like in Canada, for example, it was very difficult to export ginseng. And so weirdly, ginseng became very cheap in Canada. And I'm just wondering about like the kind of global ramifications of supply chain on like practice, and if that was enough, if you noticed that, or if there was a problem with that.
Thank you, Chris. So as far as this language of brains, I think this was a part of the political maneuvering, and this was part of the shift of how to sell immigration, was changing the rhetoric from having these Asian bodies, which were originally came as laboring bodies that were denied any form of citizenship but could enter because of the economic possibilities that they provided, and of course they were policed and et cetera and all of these things. But I think part of being able to sell this in this Cold War moment and to actually say to these post-colonial nations, we don't hate you, we don't think that you're just laborers anymore, come into this kind of democratic fold, this language shift started to happen because it was necessary in order to create these kinds of networks of movement and surveillance.
Thank you for your question. I'm not specialized in this ginseng global circulation global chain, but it's a really good question because it's true that I developed before the COVID program another one. I was really interested in the question how the Chinese medicine has been practiced in France, but very connected with the migrant labor movement, especially like the case like the Mrs. Tai, for example. And I did focus on the skilled practices and not really the product, because I tried really hard because I identified the seahorse. And I went to the different Chinese medicine selling store, and I tried to buy and try to discuss with them to do some ethnographic work, but I haven't really accepted on the field work. So I had. It was really hard for me to open this work, but as far as I know, it's true that in France we had actually there are two levels. There is European Union levels in terms of how to regulate the Chinese medicine staff and products, and also the French level, national level politics. And I know that some these kind of Chinese medicine products, they have been transported to France from the Germany and the Holland. So, for example, if we compare in Paris, the mostly a majority of this kind of store, there are few. I mean, in Paris, they always have some hidden gates, and you can't really identify very clearly what is it. So it's really between the formal and the informal. It's quite informal, and sometimes it's some undergraduate economy. So it's really interesting to study, I think, but difficult to open the gate. If we compare with Amsterdam or even in the UK, London, so the regulation is totally different. So we can see, of course, in Canada it's the same. But I mean, even within the European countries, we have a high diversity politics towards the Chinese medicine.
Yes, we've got 5 minutes.
I have a question about the doctor shortages, which is like, and maybe it was discussed earlier because I wasn't here for the prior panels, but I'm curious what caused it to emerge as a problem in the early 60s, as opposed, like what happened between 1924 and 1965 that caused that particular problem to emerge?
A lot of factors. From the beginning of the 20th century, what historians of medicine refer to as established medicine or organized medicine was really invested in limiting the number of physicians that that were educated and that could practice. And part of this was an investment in maintaining the status, the authority of the physician figure. And so that had repercussions over time as the population post-World War II really increased. And so you had this mismatch between the number of new babies and old people who are the highest demographic users and the number of physicians. Another big factor in all of this was that there was just a different relationship to access to medical care. So there was part of the medical civil rights movement where people felt that they had more of a right and an investment in actually getting these kinds of services. And so they were making demands on getting those kinds of services. And this was really much a part of the civil rights conversations, and that healthcare and this limiting of it was just as much a part of this equality framework as anything else, and that and hospitals also desegregated. So part of civil rights passage, in order to get Medicare and Medicaid funding from the government, hospitals had to desegregate, which also meant that more people then could enter and actually access care. So it was a lot of factors that I think brought about this question of the shortage, and also that it was this Cold War moment where having a lot of physician and scientific manpower was absolutely vital to whatever Cold War success, the vision of what that success would be, especially vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And so broadcasting any kind of shortage was detrimental on many, many kinds of levels. So yeah, I think it was this culmination of these domestic and geopolitical factors that brought about this declaration of crisis at this moment. And then immigration came in as, oh wow, this is a really easy stopgap at this moment.
I think last question, yes.
So
please.
just to follow on from that, it's been just fascinating hearing about the kind of racial politics around these, the doctor shortage and foreign medical graduates. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to another way that was, that people used to try to address the doctor shortage, which is the use of physician extenders, quote unquote, such as nurse practitioners, physician assistants, and how that compares, whether hierarchically or in other ways to what you're talking about.
Yes, thank you. So there was a big movement at the same time. There's a rise in, sometimes it's terms auxiliary health professionals, to help offset some of this increased demand. And at the beginning, when there was a rise in these other kinds of professionals, there was really a reluctance of physicians to actually allow these practitioners to enter into these spaces because it was this kind of jurisdictional problem that was at stake. And it's a hugely gendered kind of dynamic. So who are you ceding authority to? How much authority are you ceding, and what does that mean? If somebody can do 50% of your job, what does that mean in terms of your salary, your masculinity, your professional status, your authority? So there were all of these kinds of jurisdictional conversations that were definitely at play in the 1960s. And I think that I actually haven't fully followed the debates past the 1960s. My instinct is that they still remain very, very much a part of these kinds of conversations, except the reality of the need for all of these different kinds of health professionals has allowed for more of them to be able to actually do the care work. So maybe there are different, and I'm getting a much more educated answer from a nod over there.
There's a dark side of it, which is, yes, enormous growth in mostly nurse practitioners in all the fields, enormous growth. Great nurses had their clinics all to themselves. They got prescribing power, blah, blah, blah. Here's what happens. When there's a real crisis, so what about the opioid crisis? What about the crisis of over prescribing to children of psychiatric medicine? What's responsible? It's the nurse practitioners. Got it? With the primary care.
Interesting, it was the same dynamics between midwives and surgeons in the 18th century. And midwives complained that, who was to blame if there's a problem with the birth, but the midwife.
Well, on that really
cheerful and somewhat jaded.
So please join us. And we'll be starting at, you're welcome to come in at 4 tomorrow. We'll be at the Barker Center. The room is 114. It's not very big, but we'll have signs.
Across the river.
It's across the river. Yes, the Barker Center at Harvard, which is where the Mahindra Center is. So we'll be continuing the conversation there for those of you who have joined us either virtually or in person. But what a wonderful set of papers. Thank you all so much for being here and for the really rich beginning to the conversation. And do either of you want water? Yeah. I figured. Thank you so much. Yeah, no problem. Thank you. It was nice to meet you.
Great.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Oh, yeah, perfect. Okay, well, thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate it. Yeah.
Here in Northeastern or?